Before we get into tonight's story, I want to take a moment to thank Dan. For the video idea, your dedication to finding the stories that deserve to be told is exactly what keeps this channel alive, and tonight we are diving into one of the most detailed, most contested, and most quietly unsettling UFO incidents ever recorded in the United Kingdom. So thank you, sincerely, for pushing this one to the top of the list. And while we are in this space together, I want to ask you one small favour that takes 10 seconds and genuinely changes everything for this channel. If you are listening to Sleep Theories on Spotify, please leave us a review. 10 seconds. That is all it takes, and it helps more than you could possibly imagine. It helps new listeners find their way here, to this quiet corner of the night where the strange and the true sit side by side. Now, close your eyes if you're somewhere safe. Let your breathing slow. And let me take you to a village in South Wales on a cold February night, a night that the official record says was nothing more than a routine military exercise, a night that, for one woman in particular, was anything but. The village that heard the sky. There are places in the world that seem designed for quiet, where the hills absorb sound, where the dark arrives early and stays long, where the kind of silence that city people spend thousands of dollars chasing is simply the weather. Unremarkable, ordinary, permanent. Pentyrch is one of those places. Nestled in the rolling countryside of South Wales, just a few miles northwest of Cardiff, the village has stood for centuries in the shadow of gentle hills and wide open sky. It is the kind of place where residents know the names of their neighbours, where the sound of a passing car after 10 in the evening registers as something worth noting, where the sky above is dark enough most nights to see stars. On the evening of February the 26th, 2016, the sky above Pentyrch was not dark and still. It was alive, not with stars, not with the ordinary movements of civilian aircraft arcing their way toward Cardiff Airport, not with the distant grumble of a passing freight helicopter or the thin white scratch of a commercial jet climbing to altitude. It was alive with something else entirely, something that residents would spend the next several years trying to explain, and that the official record would close within days with a single tidy phrase: routine military exercise. But for one woman who stood in her garden and watched the sky fill with things she'd never seen before, a woman named Caz Clarke, the official explanation was never enough. And what she documented in the months and years that followed would transform a single strange night in a quiet Welsh village into one of the most extensively analysed, most fiercely debated, and most quietly compelling UFO cases in the modern history of the United Kingdom. This is the story of what happened over Pentyrch, or at least, it is the story of what we know. Part 1. The sound that didn't belong. Caz Clarke was at home that evening. She has described it as an ordinary night. Nothing about the preceding hours that would have suggested anything unusual was coming. The kind of evening where you settle in, where the house is warm, where the business of living occupies your attention without drama. Just a cold February night in South Wales, unremarkable in every way. Until the sound began. She noticed it first, not as something she could hear clearly, but as something she could feel. A deep, low-frequency vibration that seemed to move through the walls of the house before it resolved into anything identifiable. A rolling pressure, almost subaudible, that registered in the chest more than in the ears. The kind of sound that unsettles you before you can explain why, before you have even consciously recognized that you are hearing something unusual. She stepped outside, and the sound became a roar. Overhead, multiple helicopters had appeared. Not one, not two, multiple. An unusual density of rotary aircraft for any setting, but extraordinary for a quiet village in the Welsh hills at 8:30 in the evening. Their lights cut through the low cloud cover, their engines overlapped into a wash of mechanical noise that filled the valley from side to side, that bounced off the hills and came back distorted, layered, impossible to localise to any single source. And then the jets arrived. Fast-moving, lower than commercial aircraft have any business flying over a residential area at night, cutting across the sky in arcs that Clarke would later describe as purposeful. Not the lazy linear path of a routine sortie, not the clean climbing angle of a military aircraft heading to altitude for a training run. These were arcs, sweeping, curved, deliberate movements that suggested the aircraft were orienting themselves around something, responding to something, maintaining position relative to something that Clarke had not yet seen. The entire valley shook with layered engine noise. This was not a single aircraft on a routine flight. This was coordinated. Multiple platforms, multiple types, moving in ways that suggested a shared purpose. The helicopters hovered and circled, the jets swept and banked, and the sound built and built until it was less like noise and more like weather. Something you could not escape, something that surrounded you entirely. Clarke stood in her garden and looked up, and that is when she saw it. People who study witness testimony in unusual aerial events will often tell you that the initial report, the first words out of the witness's mouth, before interpretation takes over, before language is refined, is frequently the most revealing. Not because it is the most polished or the most detailed, but because it captures the unmediated experience. The raw impression before the brain has had time to slot things into familiar categories. Clarke's initial description of what she saw above the tree line that night is worth sitting with. It was large, it was dark, it was shaped, and this detail would become one of the most discussed elements of her account. Like a pyramid, or like something approximating a pyramid. A shape that was widest at the base and narrowed toward the top. A shape that seemed, in her words, to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. Not a glowing object, not a bright object, a dark object, one that registered as a shape because of what it obscured rather than what it emitted, and around it, smaller objects, luminous, moving. Whether they were separate craft or lights attached to the main object or something else entirely, Clarke could not say with certainty. But they were there, multiple points of light, orbiting or hovering in close proximity to the larger shape, and the helicopters were circling it. This is the detail that Clarke would return to again and again in the years that followed. Not that she saw an unusual object, not that the sky was filled with military aircraft, but the relationship between the two, the way the helicopters moved relative to the thing above the tree line, the way the jets swept through the sky in arcs that seemed calibrated to maintain a specific distance from it. The sense, visceral, immediate, unmistakable, that what she was watching was not random, was not incidental, was not the accidental convergence of a military exercise and a misidentified civilian aircraft. What she was watching, she would later say, felt like a controlled engagement. It was not random. They were around it. They were there because of it. That is the only way I can describe what I saw. Whatever was in the sky that night, the aircraft were there because of it. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the object was gone. Not in any dramatic way. Not a streak of light or a sudden acceleration into the upper atmosphere. Gone in the way that things disappear in low cloud and darkness. Present, and then simply no longer visible. Whether it moved or whether it was obscured, or whether something else entirely happened in those final moments, Clarke cannot say. She only knows that one moment it was there, and then it was not. The aircraft lingered for a time. Then they too dispersed, and the sky above Pentyrch was quiet again. Part 2. The object above the trees. Let us spend some time with the object itself, because this is where the Pentyrch case diverges most sharply from the general category of UFO report, from the vague, impressionistic accounts that investigators often receive, accounts of lights in the sky or unusual shapes at a distance that resist any specific description. Clarke was close. Whatever she saw was not distant. It was above the tree line of a nearby ridge in the middle. Distance, far enough to be difficult to measure with precision, close enough to perceive shape, proportion, surface quality, and what she describes is specific enough to be notable. The pyramid shape is the detail that generates the most discussion. It is worth being precise about what that description implies and what it does not. Clarke has never claimed certainty about the exact geometry of the object. She has described it as pyramid-shaped, or approximating that shape. Something that narrowed from a wider base to a more pointed apex. Whether it was a perfect geometric pyramid, whether it was a rough approximation, whether the low cloud and unusual lighting conditions introduced some distortion, these are questions she acknowledges cannot be answered with certainty. What she's certain about is the size. The object was large. Not aircraft carrier large, not building large, but large in the way that makes you recalibrate your sense of scale. Large enough that it dominated the portion of sky it occupied. Large enough that when it was present, it was unmistakably the most significant thing in the visual field. Larger than any conventional aircraft she was familiar with, and Clarke, living in the flight path of various military training routes in South Wales, was familiar with military aircraft. She had seen them. She knew what they looked like. This was not that. The surface quality is perhaps the strangest element of her description. The detail that resists easy explanation. She describes it as dark. Not merely dark in colour, but dark in a way that suggested it was absorbing light rather than reflecting it. This is a precise observation, and it aligns, whether by coincidence or otherwise, with a class of phenomena described in certain advanced aerospace materials research. Surfaces engineered to minimise radar cross-section often exhibit unusual optical properties. They can appear to absorb ambient light, to render the object less visible rather than more, to create the impression that the object is, in some sense, a hole in the sky, rather than a thing occupying space. But Clarke was not thinking about stealth materials. She was standing in her garden in a Welsh village, looking up at something enormous that seemed to pull the sky into itself, and it was not making a sound. This is the detail that investigators return to most consistently. Silent flight at that scale, that proximity, that level of clearly visible physical presence and silence. Modern military aircraft are extraordinary machines. The most advanced fighters in operation today represent the absolute frontier of human aerospace engineering. And even they are loud. Even at altitude, even at distance, the acoustic signature of a jet engine is unmistakable. A helicopter generates noise that carries for miles. The physics of conventional propulsion simply does not permit the kind of silence Clarke describes. Not at the scale she is describing, not at the proximity she is describing. Which leaves, as always, a handful of possibilities. The first, Clarke's perception was distorted by the extraordinary noise of the surrounding aircraft, and the object was in fact generating sound that she simply could not separate from the broader acoustic environment. This is plausible. The helicopters were loud, the jets were loud. In that kind of acoustic wash, a lower frequency sound signature might simply have been masked. The second, the object was employing a form of propulsion that does not generate the conventional acoustic signature of jet or rotary engine systems. Something that creates lift or movement through means other than combustion and mechanical rotation. This is the explanation that the more technically minded UFO researchers reach for, and it has the virtue of accounting for the silence without requiring Clarke to be wrong about what she observed. The third possibility is the one that neither of those categories quite captures. The one that sits in the space between known technology and acknowledged ignorance. The one that the Pentyrch case ultimately refuses to resolve. Something was there, it was large, it was dark, it did not make a sound, and the military aircraft in that sky that night were not flying past it. They were flying around it. Part 3. The official explanation. Within days of the events of February the 26th, 2016, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence had issued its formal position on the night over Pentyrch. There had been military exercises in the area, routine, scheduled. The aircraft involved, RAF jets and military helicopters, were conducting training operations consistent with their regular operational tempo. No unusual aerial object had been detected. No unidentified craft had entered controlled UK airspace. No engagement of any kind had taken place. Case closed. This is, in structure and in tone, a deeply familiar response. Anyone who has spent time studying the institutional history of UFO reporting in the United Kingdom, or in the United States, or in France, or in any country with a functioning military and a publicly accountable government, will recognise the shape of it immediately. The acknowledgement of activity, the characterisation of that activity as routine, the specific denial of any anomalous element, the absence of any invitation for further inquiry. It is worth being precise about what the MOD statement did and did not say. It did not say that nothing unusual happened that night. It said that nothing unusual was recorded. These are meaningfully different claims. One is a statement about events, the other is a statement about documentation, and the gap between them is exactly where the Pentyrch case lives. Clarke did not accept the explanation, not because she was predisposed to reject official statements, not because she was, prior to that night, a particularly devoted UFO researcher or conspiracy theorist. She was, by her own description, an ordinary resident of an ordinary Welsh village who had seen something extraordinary and wanted to understand it. And when the official explanation arrived, and she held it up against her own experience of that night, against the scale of what she had seen, against the behaviour of the aircraft, against the silence of the thing above the tree line, it did not fit, so she began to document. What followed was not a casual collection of notes and impressions. It was a systematic, methodical, years-long project of research, of mapping, of cross-referencing, of filing freedom of information requests, of speaking with other witnesses, of consulting aviation experts, of building, piece by piece, an alternative picture of that night. A picture in which the official explanation was not necessarily false, but in which it was demonstrably incomplete. What Clarke found, as she began to pull at the threads, of the official account would raise questions that the Ministry of Defence has never answered. It is worth pausing here to consider the institutional logic of the official response, not to be cynical about it, not to assume automatically that the MOD was concealing something, but to think clearly about what pressures and incentives shape the way governments respond to reports of this kind. Military organisations have a structural interest in keeping their operational activities opaque. This is not conspiracy, it is function. The effective operation of a military depends in part on adversaries not knowing exactly what it is doing, where, when, or why. An RAF training exercise that happens to be conducted in a way that attracts public attention is, from an institutional perspective, a problem to be managed rather than a mystery to be explained. The path of least resistance is precisely the one the MOD took. Acknowledge that something was happening, characterise it as routine, and close the door. This does not mean that the explanation is false. It means that the institutional incentive to provide that particular explanation exists regardless of what actually happened, which means that the existence of the official explanation tells us almost nothing about the events it purports to explain. Clarke understood this, and it is why she kept digging. Part 4. The timeline problem. In the months following the events of February the 26th, Clarke began the painstaking work of reconstructing the night in granular detail. Not from memory alone, though her memory of the event remained vivid, but from every available external source: flight tracking data, public airspace records, weather reports, the testimony of other witnesses in the Pentyrch area and surrounding villages, and the official records that the Ministry of Defence had agreed, through freedom of information channels, to release. What she was looking for was confirmation, some external record that matched what she had seen. An official acknowledgement, however oblique, of the scale and character of the aerial activity that night. What she found instead was a discrepancy. The number of aircraft that witnesses reported seeing that night, Clarke herself, and others who came forward in the weeks and months following, did not match the number of aircraft officially acknowledged, not by a small margin, by a margin significant enough to suggest that either the witnesses were systematically wrong, or that the official record was systematically incomplete. Multiple witnesses described more aircraft than the MOD admitted to having in the area, more helicopters, more jets, a density of military aviation activity that, if accurately reported, would represent an unusually significant deployment for a routine training exercise, particularly over a residential area at night. But it was the radar data, or rather the absence of it, that Clarke found most troubling. She had obtained, through patient freedom of information work, certain records relating to airspace activity that night. And what those records showed, and more importantly what they did not show, raised a question that she could not resolve. Some of the aircraft that witnesses reported in the sky over Pentyrch did not appear in the available radar records in ways that fully accounted for their reported movements. Specifically, there appeared to be activity that witnesses described as occurring in and around controlled airspace that could not be matched, one-to-one, with the available flight log data. Aircraft that witnesses placed in specific locations at specific times did not have corresponding entries in the records that should, under normal circumstances, have captured them. This could mean many things. It could mean that witnesses were mistaken about locations or timing, the kind of error that night, cloud cover, and an unusually stressful visual experience can easily produce. It could mean that certain military operations legitimately operate under transponder rules that make them invisible to conventional radar tracking. This is real, and it is not inherently sinister. It could mean that the records Clarke received were incomplete, either through administrative error or deliberate redaction, or it could mean something else. Clarke was careful not to overstate what the discrepancy proved. She has consistently described it as an inconsistency, a place where the official record and the witnessed record do not fully align, rather than as proof of any particular interpretation. But the inconsistency was real, and it was not trivial, and it was not the kind of thing that tends to arise in connection with genuinely routine training exercises, which generate documentation precisely because they are routine. When you map what was officially acknowledged against what was reported by the people who were there, something does not add up. And in the world of anomalous aerial events, things that do not add up have a way of mattering. There is a broader pattern worth noting here, not to establish it as proof of anything, but because it speaks to the structural conditions under which cases like Pentyrch unfold. Documentation is the lifeblood of accountability. In modern governance, the principle that official actions generate official records is not merely bureaucratic tidiness. It is the mechanism by which the public retains any meaningful ability to verify what its institutions are doing. When records are incomplete, or when they fail to align with independently verified facts, that gap is significant regardless of what caused it. Clarke's timeline research did not resolve the Pentyrch case, but it established, firmly and with documented evidence, that the case was not as simple as the official explanation suggested, that something happened on February the 26th, 2016, in the skies above South Wales that the public record does not fully account for. What that something was, that remained, as it remains today, an open question. Part 5. What the body remembers. In the days following the sighting, Clarke began to notice something wrong with her body. She had not expected this. The sighting itself had been disorienting, the kind of experience that leaves you unsettled, that you turn over and over in your mind, that you struggle to contextualize. But physical symptoms were something else, something that, when they appeared, pushed the experience into a different and more troubling register. The most visible symptom was on her face: irritation, redness, sensitivity, a quality she would later describe as resembling mild burns, not severe, not debilitating, but visible, localized to the parts of her face that had been exposed to the sky during the sighting, the parts that had been, in some sense, facing whatever was above, the tree line. There was also fatigue, not ordinary tiredness, but a heaviness, a depletion that went beyond what the stress and disruption of an unusual night might explain. A tiredness that settled in and did not lift in the way that ordinary tiredness lifts. That persisted for days in a way that prompted her to pay attention, and sensitivity to light. A photosensitivity that had not been present before the night of February the 26th, and that Clarke noticed in the days that followed. A threshold that had shifted, an intolerance for brightness that had not previously characterized her experience. She sought medical attention. The symptoms were noted, but no cause was identified. No official medical explanation was ever confirmed that connected these symptoms to the events of that night, or to any specific environmental exposure during the sighting. Clarke believes the symptoms were caused by proximity to the object, or to whatever forces surrounded it. Whatever propulsion system it used, or whatever field effects it generated, or whatever the interaction between it and the military aircraft produced in terms of electromagnetic or other environmental outputs. She is not the first person to describe physical symptoms following a close proximity UFO encounter. The literature on this subject, setting aside entirely the question of what these objects are, is substantial. Cases in which witnesses report skin irritation, unusual fatigue, photosensitivity, and other symptoms in the days following an encounter represent one of the more consistent threads running through decades of reported close proximity sightings across multiple countries. The fact that this pattern exists does not, on its own, validate any particular interpretation of those sightings. Unusual physical symptoms following an unusual and stressful experience can arise from many sources that do not require exotic explanation. Psychological stress, disrupted sleep, the physiological effects of a sudden adrenaline response. These are real, and they are not trivial, but Clarke's account of her symptoms is detailed and specific, and the specific constellation she describes, the facial irritation localized to exposed skin, the unusual fatigue, the photosensitivity, aligns with the pattern documented in other cases in ways that are at minimum worth noting. She was never compensated. She was never officially contacted by anyone from the Ministry of Defence or any other government body about the physical effects she reported. The case remained, officially, a routine military exercise with no anomalous elements, and Clarke remained with symptoms she could not explain in a village that the official record insisted had experienced nothing unusual. Part 6. The Pattern in the Evidence. In the years following the Pentyrch event, a number of independent researchers and UFO investigators began to examine the case in detail. What they found when they laid the Pentyrch incident alongside other well-documented cases from the past several decades was a pattern that proved difficult to dismiss. It was not a pattern in the objects themselves. The literature on unidentified aerial phenomena is plagued by the inconsistency of the things being reported. The range of shapes, sizes, behaviours and effects is so wide that attempting to construct a unified theory of what these objects are from witness accounts alone is largely an exercise in frustration. Every case is different. Every encounter resists the taxonomy that would make it easier to analyse. But the pattern that researchers noted in connection with Pentyrch was not in the object. It was in the response. When significant UFO sightings occur, particularly those that involve multiple witnesses, close proximity, and unusual physical characteristics, they are, with striking regularity, accompanied by a specific sequence of official actions, military presence typically arriving quickly and in greater numbers than the described activity would seem to warrant. A rapid official explanation issued before any extensive public inquiry has been conducted, and then minimal follow-up. The case is closed before it is really opened. The explanation is provided before the questions are fully formed. Pentyrch followed this pattern precisely. Military aircraft arrived in numbers that witnesses found extraordinary. An explanation was issued within days, and then the institutional machinery fell silent. No extended inquiry. No public engagement with the inconsistencies that Clarke's research had identified. No acknowledgement that the scale of the response, if the witness accounts were anywhere near accurate, seemed disproportionate to the stated cause. This pattern is sometimes cited by skeptics as evidence that the military knows exactly what these things are, and is embarrassed to admit that their own experimental platforms are generating public alarm. There is a version of this argument that is quite compelling, that many UFO sightings are in fact sightings of classified military technology, and that the rapid official response is designed precisely to suppress public curiosity about capabilities that governments are not prepared to acknowledge. This is not a conspiracy theory in the dismissive sense. It is a structurally coherent explanation that accounts for several features of cases like Pentyrch without requiring anything beyond the known tendency of military organisations to protect information about their capabilities. But it runs into a problem in the Pentyrch case specifically, because if what Clarke described was a classified military aircraft, an experimental platform of unusual design being tested over South Wales, then the behaviour of the surrounding aircraft makes a different kind of sense. They were there to monitor it, to accompany it, to manage the airspace around it, and that is precisely how Clarke described them behaving. The question is whether that aircraft was ours, whether it was human in origin, because if it was simply a classified platform being tested by the RAF or by another NATO ally, then the night over Pentyrch is embarrassing but explicable. And if it was not, that is where the case becomes something else entirely. Part 7. The theory beneath the exercise. There is a version of the Pentyrch story that begins not with a routine military exercise but with a contact event. This is the interpretation advanced by a subset of the researchers who have studied the case most closely, and it is worth laying out in detail, not because it is certainly true, but because it represents a coherent reading of the available evidence that the official explanation does not fully displace. The theory goes like this. In the early evening of February the 26th, 2016, something entered controlled UK airspace over South Wales. Something that was not broadcasting a transponder code. Something that did not correspond to any scheduled civilian or military flight. Something that, when it appeared on whatever systems were tracking it, prompted an immediate and significant military response. The aircraft that Clarke and other witnesses saw arriving in the sky over Pentyrch were not there for a training exercise. They were scrambled, dispatched in response to the presence of the unidentified object, to observe it, to track it, and possibly to intercept or at least approach it if an opportunity presented itself. The military exercise in this reading was not the event, it was the cover. The explanation that could be issued quickly and coherently. That was technically defensible, since military training does occur in Welsh airspace, and that would forestall the more difficult questions that a more transparent account of the night would inevitably generate. This kind of operational cover is not, it should be said, unprecedented in the history of government responses to anomalous aerial events. Researchers who have examined declassified documents from both the United Kingdom and the United States have found cases where military activity was characterised publicly as training or exercise activity, when the internal documentation suggests a more complex reality. The infrastructure of plausible deniability exists, and it has been used. What supports the Pentyrch version of this theory specifically? The scale of the response for one, multiple helicopter types, fast jet assets, a density of military aviation that, for a routine training exercise over a small Welsh village, seems excessive. Training exercises are not typically conducted at that scale over residential areas at night, without any prior notification to local authorities or residents, and no such notification was issued in connection with the night of February the 26th. The behaviour of the aircraft for another. Clarke's description of the jets sweeping in arcs around the object, maintaining distance, circling rather than departing, behaving as though oriented around a specific point in space, is not the description of a training exercise. It is the description of an escort, or a perimeter, or an observation pattern, and the silence of the primary object. If the military was conducting a training exercise involving conventional aircraft, every aircraft in that sky should have been audible. The absence of acoustic signature from the largest and most visually prominent object is the detail that most resists the conventional explanation, because conventional military aircraft, no matter how advanced, are not silent. Put these elements together and a different picture emerges. Not necessarily a picture of extraterrestrial visitation. The evidence does not get us that far, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging the limits of what can be claimed, but a picture of something in the sky that night that the available official explanation does not adequately account for. Something that the military responded to with urgency and that it subsequently chose not to discuss. Whether that something was of human origin, some black budget platform whose existence the government was not prepared to acknowledge, or whether it was something else, that is the question the Pentyrch case poses and refuses to answer. Part 8. The silence and what it means. Let us return, one final time, to the silence. Because in a case full of strange details, the pyramid shape, the dark surface that seemed to absorb light, the circling military aircraft, the timeline discrepancies, the physical symptoms, It is the silence that most consistently stops the conversation. The detail that researchers and physicists and aerospace engineers, when they engage with the Pentyrch account, cannot easily step past. Sound is the inevitable byproduct of conventional propulsion. You cannot burn fuel and generate thrust without generating acoustic energy. You cannot spin rotor blades without generating acoustic energy. You cannot generate lift through any conventionally understood mechanism without generating acoustic energy. This is not a design flaw in human aerospace technology. It is a consequence of the physical principles on which that technology operates. Silent flight, at scale, is not something that exists in the publicly acknowledged catalogue of human aviation. There are quieter aircraft. There are aircraft designed to minimize acoustic signature. But silent, genuinely, completely silent, at the size and proximity Clarke describes, does not exist. Not in anything the public knows about. What does exist in the classified aerospace programs of various government agencies is harder to know. The history of defense technology is, among other things, a history of capabilities that were real long before they were publicly acknowledged. Stealth technology was operational for a decade before it was revealed. Drone technology was mature before it entered public discourse. The gap between classified capability and public knowledge is real and substantial, and anyone reasoning from public knowledge alone about the limits of what human technology can do is reasoning from an incomplete picture. But even accounting for that gap, even granting the widest possible scope to classified aerospace development, the silent large-scale flight that Clarke describes pushes against what the physics of propulsion are understood to permit, not just against what is publicly known, but against what our current understanding of the physical world suggests should be possible, unless the propulsion system is doing something that our understanding of physics does not yet account for. This is where the conversation becomes very difficult to have in a sober and analytical register, because the moment you introduce the possibility of physics transcending technology, you have opened a door that is very hard to close responsibly. Every extraordinary claim has its advocates. Every anomalous observation can be recruited into a framework that places it beyond rational scrutiny. But the Pentyrch case does not require that door to be opened carelessly. It simply requires acknowledging that the silence of the object Clarke described is a fact, a reported fact from a consistent and detailed witness, that the official explanation does not address, not in any way. The MOD statement does not say what the silent, dark, pyramid-shaped object was. It says there was no unusual object. These are different claims, and the first claim does not become more plausible simply because the second is asserted with institutional authority. Whatever was in the sky above Pentyrch on February the 26th, 2016, it was not meant to be heard, or it could not be heard, and in either case, the question of what exactly, remains exactly as open as it was the moment Clarke stepped back inside and the valley fell silent again. Part 9. The witnesses who came forward. Clarke was not alone. In the weeks and months following the events of February the 26th, as Clarke began to speak publicly about what she had seen, others came forward, quietly in many cases, without fanfare, without the appetite for attention that tends to characterise the less credible end of the UFO witness spectrum. Ordinary residents of Pentyrch and the surrounding area, people who had stood in their gardens or been woken by the noise, or glanced out of a window and seen something they did not know how to explain. Their accounts varied in detail, as accounts of the same event always do. Memory is not a recording device. Perception is not a camera. Two people standing 500 metres apart looking at the same sky at the same moment will not, under ordinary circumstances, produce identical descriptions. The perceptual differences between Clarke's account and those of other witnesses are not evidence of fabrication. They are evidence of genuine human perception. But through those variations, certain consistent elements emerged. The scale of the military aircraft activity was described consistently as extraordinary. Not one or two aircraft, but many. Helicopters and jets. A density that felt to multiple independent witnesses like something more than a training run. Several witnesses described the noise as unlike anything they had previously experienced over the area. And these were people who had lived in the flight path of Welsh military airspace for years. They knew what a training exercise sounded like. This was different. Some witnesses described seeing lights that did not correspond to the navigation lighting systems of conventional aircraft. Points of light that moved in ways they found unusual. Not the steady blinking pattern of a civilian aircraft. Not the searchlights of military helicopters. Something else. And more than one witness, independently of Clarke, described a sense, visceral, difficult to articulate, that the activity in the sky was organised around a central point, that the aircraft were not simply passing through the area, that they were in some sense present because of something else that was also present. None of these witnesses described, in the specific and detailed terms that Clarke used, a large pyramid-shaped object, but several described anomalous lights or shapes in the area of the sky where Clarke placed her object, and none of them, independently, produced an account that aligned more closely with the official explanation than with Clarke's. The corroboration is not perfect, it never is, but it exists, and it is the kind of independent, convergent, unsolicited corroboration that investigators in any field, not just UFO research, treat as meaningful when it appears. Part 10. What the landscape remembers. There is something about the geography of Pentyrch that is worth sitting with for a moment. Something about the landscape itself that becomes relevant when you consider what may have happened there. South Wales is not merely a scenic corner of the United Kingdom. It is, and has been for decades, home to a significant concentration of military infrastructure. RAF St Athan sits less than 15 miles from Pentyrch. The Brecon Beacons, the training ground of the British Army's most elite units, the SAS among them, are to the north. The airspace over Wales has been used for low-level military training for as long as modern military aviation has existed in Britain. The sound of military aircraft is not, to the residents of this region, an unusual thing, which is precisely why the February 26th event stood out to those who witnessed it. Because these were people who knew what military activity in their airspace looked and sounded like. They had reference points that residents of a city or a quieter rural area simply would not have. When they said the activity that night felt different, felt like more than a training exercise, felt organised around something, felt unlike anything they had previously seen over those hills, they were speaking from direct comparative experience. They were not simply alarmed by something unfamiliar. They were alarmed by something familiar behaving in an unfamiliar way. This is the kind of witness testimony that deserves particular weight. Not because it is definitive, it is not, but because it comes from people for whom the baseline is well established. The anomaly is more meaningful when the person reporting it has an extensive understanding of what normal looks like. And Pentyrch, in early 2016, was full of people for whom military airspace activity was background noise, until the night it was not. Part 11. The broader context. UFOs. Over Britain, the Pentyrch event did not occur in a vacuum. It arrived in the context of a long and quietly fascinating history of anomalous aerial events over the United Kingdom. A history that the British government has, over the decades, engaged with in ways ranging from serious military investigation to studied institutional indifference. The United Kingdom's Ministry of Defence ran a UFO desk, formerly titled the UFO Project, from 1950 to 2009. For nearly 60 years, the British military and government maintained an official mechanism for receiving, logging, and investigating reports of unusual aerial phenomena. When that desk was closed in 2009, the MED stated that the project had never found any evidence that UFOs represented a threat to UK airspace, or that they were of extraterrestrial origin. What the MOD did not say, and what researchers who have examined the thousands of declassified files that were released following the closure of the UFO project noted, was that the project had found a great many things it could not explain. Not extraterrestrial craft, not threats, but genuine, documented, investigated cases where the available evidence did not support a conventional explanation, where pilots reported encounters with unidentified objects that performed maneuvers beyond the capability of known aircraft, where radar operators tracked contacts that behaved in ways that defied ordinary aerodynamic models, where multiple independent witnesses reported consistent accounts of things that the official investigation could not identify or explain away. These cases did not, in the MOD's formal assessment, constitute evidence of extraterrestrial visitation, but they did constitute evidence that something was, on occasion, happening in British airspace that the military and government could not fully account for. And that evidence was real enough that the British government maintained a dedicated investigative function for almost 60 years. When the UFO project was closed in 2009, the institutional mechanism for engaging seriously with these reports was gone. When Pentyrch happened 6 years later, there was no dedicated office to receive Clarke's account, to investigate her timeline research, to engage with the corroborating witness statements. The MOD issued its statement and moved on, because that is what institutions do when they have closed the door on a category of inquiry. Clarke was left with her documentation, her discrepancies, and her unanswered questions, as were all the other witnesses, as, in a very real sense, was anyone who takes seriously the possibility that what happened over Pentyrch on February the 26th, 2016 was not simply a routine training exercise. Part 12. The Case That Would Not Close. Years after the night of February the 26th, the Pentyrch case remains open in every meaningful sense except the official one. Clarke has continued her research. She has spoken at conferences. She has appeared in documentaries. She has filed Freedom of Information request after Freedom of Information request, receiving partial responses and redacted documents, and the occasional confirmation of something she already knew, punctuated by the frequent confirmation that the information she is seeking is either not held, or is held but cannot be disclosed under one exemption or another. She has built, over years of patient, methodical, unglamorous work, the most complete public account of what happened over Pentyrch that currently exists, and it is still not complete. It cannot be complete. Because the information that would complete it, the actual internal records of what the military knew, what it tracked, what it responded to on that night, remains, if it exists at all, beyond the reach of public disclosure. This is the deepest frustration of cases like Pentyrch. Not that the truth is necessarily hidden. Not that there is necessarily a dramatic revelation sitting in a classified file somewhere that would resolve everything, but that the institutional machinery of secrecy and classification means that the space between the official explanation and the witnessed reality cannot be closed through legitimate inquiry. It can only be inhabited, lived in, examined from multiple angles, described with as much precision as the available evidence permits, without ever being resolved. Clarke has inhabited that space for years now. She is not, by the accounts of those who have spoken with her, a person consumed by obsession or driven by the need to be right. She's a person who saw something she cannot explain, who found that the explanation she was given did not fit the experience, and who responded by doing the work of trying to find out why. That is a recognisably human and deeply rational response to a genuinely unusual situation. The fact that years of work have not yielded a resolution is not a reflection of her failure. It is a reflection of the nature of the case, of the institutional structures that surround it, of the fundamental difficulty of establishing what actually happened in a Welsh sky on a cold February night, when the only entities with complete access to the relevant information have chosen not to share it. She saw something. Others saw it. The records do not fully account for it. And the explanation that was issued before anyone had properly asked the questions has never been updated, refined, or revisited. This is where the Pentyrch case lives, not in the dramatic register of confirmed extraterrestrial contact or government conspiracy. In the quieter, harder, more unsettling register of genuine uncertainty, of something real that happened, that was witnessed by multiple people, that the available official record does not adequately explain, and that the institutional mechanisms designed to provide explanation have declined to engage with meaningfully. //epilogue. The night that was explained today, if you look up the Pentyrch event in official records, you will find a tidy entry. Military exercises, routine activity, no unusual aerial phenomena, case closed. If you look up the hill road outside the village, the road that runs along the ridge above the tree line where Clarke saw the object hover, it looks exactly as it always has. Quiet, green, ordinary in the way that Welsh countryside is ordinary, profoundly, almost aggressively quiet when the weather is still. The kind of place where it is genuinely difficult, standing in the afternoon light on a calm day, to reconstruct the atmosphere of that February night. To inhabit the version of this place where the sky was full of aircraft and something dark and silent hung above the trees. But the reports remain. Clarke's account, detailed, consistent, documented, remains. The accounts of other witnesses remain. The timeline discrepancies that her research identified remain. The physical symptoms she documented remain. The pattern of response that researchers have noted, placing Pentyrch alongside other significant aerial events and finding the same fingerprints, rapid explanation, minimal follow-up, institutional silence, remains. And the silence of the object remains, in the sense that it is still, after all these years, unexplained. That no one has stood up and said, here is the technology that produced that acoustic silence at that scale. Here is the platform. Here is how it works. Here is why the explanation we gave you was true, and why the silence you found so puzzling was simply a feature of a system we were testing and prefer not to discuss in detail. That statement has never been made, which means either that the object was something that cannot be explained in those terms, something for which no such statement is possible, or that the people who could make it have chosen not to, and in either case the question stands, what was in the sky above Pentyrch on February the 26th, 2016? What was it that moved without sound through the low cloud over a Welsh village, while military aircraft swept the sky around it? What was the darkness above the tree line that absorbed the light and made no noise, and left a woman standing in her garden, with her face turned up, and her hand raised to shade her eyes against nothing? No brightness, no beam, just a shape that shouldn't have been there, surrounded by things that were clearly, unmistakably responding to its presence. We don't know. We genuinely, honestly, after years of research and documentation, and freedom of information requests and expert analysis and witness interviews and comparative case studies, we don't know. And there is something important in that not knowing, something worth holding on to rather than rushing past, because the pressure to resolve, uncertainty, to pick a side, to declare it either a misidentified military craft or an alien vessel, to close the case in one direction or the other, is exactly what the evidence does not support. The evidence supports uncertainty. It supports the conclusion that something happened that the official explanation does not fully account for, and that we do not have access to the information that would allow us to say what that something was. That is not a satisfying place to end, but it is an honest one. The night over Pentyrch was officially explained within days, but for those who were there, for Clarke, for the other witnesses who stood in their gardens and looked up at a sky that should have been quiet and wasn't, it has never been explained at all. What if the deadliest attack on a United States naval vessel since World War II wasn't an accident at all? What if 34 Americans died not in confusion, but as collateral damage in a weapons test so secret that the US government spent 50 years burying the truth beneath layers of classified silence? Before we dive into this story, I want to give a massive thank you to Mr. Hill420 and so many others who suggested this topic. Your curiosity drives these investigations, and I'm grateful for it. If you have ideas for future videos, drop them in the comments below. Now let's explore what really happened on June 8th, 1967 in the Eastern Mediterranean, and why the echoes of that day still reverberate through classified channels today. Act 1. The Silence Before the Storm. June 8th, 1967, 1400 local time. Eastern Mediterranean, 25 nautical miles off the Sinai coast. The USS Liberty cut through calm waters under a flawless Mediterranean sky. At 455 feet long and displacing over 10,000 tons, the modified Victory-class cargo ship looked unremarkable, a rusting relic of World War II pressed back into service. But appearances deceived. Bristling with antennas, microwave dishes, and SIGINT collection arrays, Liberty was the NSA's floating ear in the Middle East, listening to a region on the brink of tearing itself apart. The Six-Day War had erupted 4 days earlier. Regional powers clashed across ancient battlefields, while Cold War superpowers watched nervously from the sidelines. The Soviet Mediterranean squadron lurked just over the horizon. American forces maintained a tense neutrality, and through it all, Liberty listened. Below decks, in the cramped research spaces that reeked of coffee, cigarette smoke and hot electronics, 45 cryptologic technicians from the Naval Security Group worked in shifts. They monitored everything: military communications, diplomatic channels, encrypted transmissions from ships and aircraft across the region. Every signal, every transmission, every whispered order flowed through their receivers and into the classified intelligence pipeline feeding Fort Meade, Maryland. Petty Officer First Class Mark Reynolds had been on station for 6 hours straight. At 24 years old, he possessed the kind of focused intensity that made him perfect for signals intelligence work, able to distinguish signal from noise in the chaotic electromagnetic spectrum of a war zone. His station monitored multiple frequencies, including those reserved for American military operations. At 14:13, Reynolds's headphones crackled with a transmission that made him straighten in his chair. The signal came through on a frequency that shouldn't have been active, a restricted channel reserved for classified naval operations. The encryption pattern was sophisticated, military grade, but something felt wrong. Reynolds keyed his recorder and leaned closer. "Shadow 7 to Cyan Control," a voice said in clear English with an American accent. "Phase 2 parameters confirmed. Frequency modulation holding at 7.83 Hz. Standing by for sequence initiation." Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. Cyan Control? That designation didn't appear in any briefing material, and that frequency, 7.83 Hz, meant nothing to him in military terms. He scribbled notes frantically. A second voice responded, also American, clipped and efficient. "Cyan Control confirms. Maintain visual contact with target vessel until phase termination. Weather conditions optimal. Execute on my mark." Target vessel? Reynolds' hand moved to the intercom switch to alert the communications officer, but he hesitated. Intercepting US military communications wasn't unusual. The NSA gathered signals from American forces routinely for training and verification purposes. But this felt different. That frequency. The deliberate emphasis on visual contact. The designation Cyan. He never got the chance to report it. At 14:14, the radar operator 2 compartments forward shouted into the circuit. Multiple surface contacts bearing 090, range 30 miles and closing. Fast movers. Confirmed aircraft. On the bridge, Commander William McGonigal lowered his binoculars and squinted into the eastern sky. He'd been tracking distant aircraft for the past 20 minutes, reconnaissance flights he'd assumed. The Liberty flew an American flag the size of a garage door. The hull number was clearly visible. In these conditions, with visibility exceeding 10 miles and zero wind, there was no possibility of confusion. At 14:15, 3 unidentified jet fighters dropped from high altitude and screamed toward the Liberty at 500 knots. The first indication of hostile intent came not from weapons but from proximity. The aircraft circled the ship 3 times, low enough that sailors on deck could see them clearly. Some waved, assuming they were friendly forces. A few took photographs. Then the fighters banked hard and lined up for attack runs. What happened next would be disputed for decades, analysed frame by frame, dissected in naval courts and congressional hearings. But for the men aboard Liberty, the truth was simple and absolute. They were being attacked by unidentified forces. The first cannon rounds shredded the forward antennas at 14:16. Radar dishes exploded in sparks. Communications arrays tumbled into the sea. The aircraft made multiple passes, their weapons stitching lines of destruction across the deck and superstructure. Commander McGonagall stood on the bridge wing, fully exposed, shouting orders as shrapnel tore through steel around him. He wouldn't leave his post, wouldn't abandon the con even as the windows exploded inward and instrument panels sparked and died. Below decks, Reynolds clutched his headphones as the compartment shook. The overhead lights flickered. Then, through the static and interference, he heard it again. That American voice. Calm and analytical. Sine wave sequence maintaining coherence. Phase 2 progressing nominally. His recorder was still running. At 14:24, the fighters broke off. For 8 minutes, an eerie quiet descended. Damage control teams scrambled topside. The wounded screamed for corpsmen. Fires burned in 3 compartments. Then sonar picked up high-speed screws. 3 unidentified torpedo boats emerged from the coastal haze, their decks crowded with sailors manning deck guns. They opened fire immediately, 40mm and 20mm rounds hammering the Liberty's hull, shredding life rafts, killing sailors who'd made it to the deck. At 14:31, one of the boats fired a torpedo. The torpedo struck the Liberty on the starboard side, below the waterline, directly beneath the signal's intelligence spaces. The explosion ripped through the research compartments like a fist through tissue paper. Bulkheads buckled. Seawater rushed in. 25 men died instantly, crushed or drowned in the flooding. Mark Reynolds survived only because he'd been thrown against a bulkhead by the blast. Unconscious, bleeding, half submerged in rising water, he clutched his recorder as shipmates dragged him through the darkness toward the ladders. The attack continued for another 40 minutes. By the time the attacking forces withdrew at 15:30, Liberty was a floating wreck. 34 men were dead. 171 were wounded. The ship listed heavily to starboard, fires still burning, taking on water. But she didn't sink, and below decks, in the flooded research spaces, a magnetic tape labelled Sine Wave Intercept 6867 floated in the darkness, sealed inside Reynolds' waterproof recorder bag. Act 2. The Inquiry. September the 1967. Naval Court of Inquiry. Malta. The official inquiry convened 3 months after the attack, far from American shores and prying media. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd Jr. presided, a stern-faced officer with 30 years of service and a reputation for thorough investigation. The court's mandate was clear: determine what happened, who was responsible, and whether Liberty's crew bore any fault for their own casualties. From the beginning, something felt wrong. Witnesses testified to crystal-clear weather, a clearly marked American flag, the ship's hull number visible for miles. They described the methodical nature of the assault, not frenzied combat, but deliberate targeting of antennas and communications equipment. Some testified to seeing torpedo boats machine-gunning life rafts. The official explanation came swiftly: a case of mistaken identity during a chaotic regional conflict. Foreign forces had confused Liberty for an enemy vessel. Tragic but understandable in the fog of war, sincere apologies, compensation offered. The American government accepted this explanation within hours of the attack, but the evidence suggested otherwise. On the 3rd day of testimony, Mark Reynolds took the stand. His face was still mottled with burn scars, his left hand bandaged. He walked with a pronounced limp. The court recorder noted that he seemed nervous, kept glancing at the door. Admiral Kidd asked him to describe his duties on June 8th. Reynolds began with routine details, his station, his assignment, the frequencies he monitored. Then he paused. "Sir, I need to submit evidence," Reynolds said quietly. "What sort of evidence, Petty Officer?" "An audio recording. I made it during the attack. It contains transmissions I intercepted on a secure frequency, American voices coordinating the attack sequence." The courtroom went silent. Kidd leaned forward. "You recorded American personnel coordinating an attack on an American vessel." "I don't know what I recorded, sir. But the voices were American. They used a designation I'd never heard before, Cyan Wave. They spoke about phase sequences, frequency modulation, maintaining visual contact with the target vessel." Reynolds produced a reel-to-reel tape from a canvas bag, labelled in his own handwriting, "Cyan Wave Intercept 6867. A Navy lawyer immediately objected. The tape hadn't been submitted through proper evidence channels. Its chain of custody was questionable. Reynolds himself admitted he'd kept it hidden for 3 months, afraid of what might happen if he turned it over. Admiral Kidd examined the tape without playing it. "This will be entered into evidence and reviewed by appropriate authorities. Petty Officer Reynolds, you are to discuss this with no one outside this court. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir." The tape was logged as Evidence Item 47B, placed in a sealed envelope and transferred to a secure evidence locker. It vanished. No official record of the tape exists in the declassified inquiry documents. Reynolds' testimony about it was redacted from the public version of the proceedings. When he tried to follow up weeks later, he was told the tape had been misplaced during transfer to NSA custody for technical analysis. 3 months later, Reynolds received orders to a submarine tender in the Pacific. His security clearance was administratively reduced. His service record noted, "Not recommended for cryptologic assignments." He never spoke publicly about Liberty or Cyan Wave again. Fort Meade, Maryland, November 1967. NASA headquarters. Linda Baker had worked for the National Security Agency for 11 years, analysing signals intelligence from every corner of the globe. At 36, she was one of the senior analysts in the Naval SIGINT Division, trusted with the most sensitive intercepts. In November 1967, she was tasked with reviewing backup recordings from the Liberty attack, part of the NSA's internal assessment of what went wrong with their intelligence collection that day. The work was tedious. Hours of radio chatter, static, routine military communications. But Baker had a gift for pattern recognition, for seeing anomalies others missed. On her 4th day reviewing the backups, she noticed something odd. At several points during the attack, 1414, 1422, 1429 and 1441, her spectrum analysis showed unusual electromagnetic activity. Brief bursts of extremely low-frequency interference, lasting only seconds but powerful enough to partially distort other signals. She ran the frequencies through analysis software, 7.83 Hz, repeating. Baker frowned. That frequency was known as the Schumann resonance, the natural electromagnetic frequency of the Earth's ionosphere, created by lightning discharges globally. It had nothing to do with military communications. Radio equipment didn't operate at that frequency. It was too low, too weak, essentially background noise of the planet itself. So why did it appear in military signal intercepts at the exact moments of Liberty's attack phases? She wrote a technical memo and submitted it through channels. The response came back 3 days later. Technical artifact. Atmospheric interference. No intelligence value. But Baker wasn't satisfied. She cross-referenced the timing against the attack timeline reconstructed from survivor testimony. The frequency spikes occurred precisely when aircraft began their runs, when the torpedo boats opened fire, when the torpedo was launched. Not random atmospheric interference, coordinated. She tried to dig deeper, requesting access to Liberty's raw intercept logs, the unprocessed recordings captured by the ship's equipment. Her request was denied. Those materials were classified at a level above your current access. Linda Baker had top-secret clearance. What could be above that? She tried a different approach. Using her access to the NSA's internal file system, she searched for any mention of Cyan Wave. One result appeared, a project file from 1965 heavily redacted, sponsored jointly by DARPA and the Office of Naval Intelligence. The project number was CW-12/7. The file contained only 3 pages. Most of it was blacked out, but one paragraph remained visible. Project Cyan Wave explores applications of extremely low-frequency electromagnetic modulation for tactical radar signature manipulation. Testing requires controlled combat environment with multiple sensor platforms. Operational security classification, Cosmic Top Secret. Cosmic Top Secret was a NATO designation, higher than anything in the standard US classification system. Baker printed the page, then immediately regretted it. She looked around her cubicle, suddenly paranoid. This wasn't just classified. This was the kind of material people's careers ended over. She folded the page into her purse and deleted her search history. That night she typed a summary of her findings and mailed it to herself at her home address. If something happened to her at work, if these files disappeared, or she was suddenly reassigned, at least she'd have proof she'd seen them. 2 weeks later, her supervisor called her into a meeting. NSA Security was conducting a routine review of database access logs. Nothing to worry about, just standard procedure. They asked her about her search for Cyan Wave. Baker kept her face neutral. I came across the term in a Liberty Intercept backup and wanted to understand the context. And did you? No, the file was mostly redacted. The security officer smiled. Good. That means the classification system is working. In the future, if you encounter project names you don't recognize, please submit an information request through proper channels rather than searching directly. Understood. Understood. She wasn't reassigned, her clearance wasn't revoked, but the message was clear: some doors stay closed. Linda Baker returned to her routine work, analysing intercepts from Vietnam and the Soviet Union. She never searched for Cyan Wave again, but she kept that printed page hidden in a safety deposit box. Act 3. The Declassified Ghost. 2003 to 2017. The Long Thaw. In the years following the Cold War's end, the intelligence community slowly began declassifying historical materials under the Freedom of Information Act. Thousands of pages from the 1960s and 70s filtered into public archives, NSA operational summaries, CIA memoranda, military intelligence assessments. The USS Liberty attack, still controversial decades later, attracted particular attention from researchers and conspiracy theorists. Survivors had formed advocacy groups. Journalists had written books questioning the official mistaken identity narrative. The government maintained its story quietly but firmly. In 2003, the NSA released the first batch of Liberty-related intercepts, heavily redacted but enough to confirm that the agency had been monitoring communications in real time during the attack. Linda Baker, now retired and 72 years old, read about the release in the Washington Post. She'd thought about that day in 1967 occasionally over the decades, wondered what had really happened to that tape, whether anyone else had noticed those strange frequency spikes. She requested her old security clearance be reactivated, a privilege available to retired intelligence personnel for consulting work. The approval took 6 months, but eventually she received her credentials and access to the NSA's historical archives in College Park, Maryland. She spent 3 weeks reading through the declassified Liberty materials. Most of it she'd seen before: the attack timeline, intercept summaries, damage reports. But then she noticed something. In the official NSA summary from June 1967, the page numbers jumped. Page 13 was followed by page 15. Page 14 was missing. Baker checked the original classification log. Page 14 had been titled Classified Naval Operations, Coordination with Advanced Research Projects. That page remained classified. She submitted a FOIA request for page 14 specifically. The response took 2 years. Denied. Material still classified in the interest of national security. But Baker had spent 11 years at NSA. She knew how to read around redactions, how to find information in metadata and file structures. She started pulling every document from 1967 that referenced classified naval operations in the Mediterranean. Most were routine: submarine deployments, carrier group movements, Soviet naval tracking operations. Then she found it. A budget document from early 1967, listing project expenditures for the Office of Naval Research. Buried in a table of appropriations, CW 12/7, Field Test Coordination, $8.7 million. The date range, May 15th, 1967 to June 30th, 1967, exactly covering the period of the Six-Day War. Baker's hands trembled as she photographed the page with her phone. After 50 years, proof that sine wave wasn't a phantom, wasn't something she'd imagined. She kept digging. Over the next 2 years she found fragments, a 1968 memo from DARPA referencing successful field demonstration of phase cancellation radar spoofing technology in operational environment, a 1970 patent application, US Patent 5,159,703, for electromagnetic signature modulation device, listing 3 inventors from Raytheon Advanced Systems and the Naval Research Laboratory. A 1982 intelligence report on Soviet radar capabilities noting, Soviet naval defense systems exhibit vulnerability to low-frequency phase modulation, similar to effects observed during classified operations in 1967. The pattern was unmistakable. Sine wave had been real, it had been tested, and Liberty had been there when it happened. But why attack the ship? If Liberty was collecting data for the NSA, if this was an American military operation, why would they attack their own intelligence vessel? Unless Liberty wasn't supposed to be there, unless the ship's presence was unauthorized, and its advanced listening equipment threatened to record something that was never meant to be recorded. Unless Liberty itself was the target, not by foreign forces, but by elements within the US military, conducting a weapons test that required complete secrecy. 2017. The breakthrough. In March 2017, the NSA released another batch of Liberty documents, the most extensive yet, over 3,000 pages. Researchers around the world began combing through them. Linda Baker, now 86 and fighting lung cancer, received a call from James Wilson, a historian at the Naval War College who'd been studying Liberty for 2 decades. "Linda, I found something," Wilson said, "in the intercept logs. There's a reference to your name." "What kind of reference?" "A memo from December 1967. Subject: Analyst concerns regarding low-frequency interference in Liberty intercepts. It says you submitted a technical report about unusual electromagnetic readings during the attack. Did you?" "Yes. They told me it was atmospheric interference. The memo says your analysis was forwarded to something called the Advanced Concepts Group for evaluation. That group reported directly to the NSA director. Whatever you found, Linda, it went to the very top." Baker felt a chill. "What else does it say?" "That your findings were consistent with expected technical signatures of active countermeasure systems." "Linda, they knew. They knew what you'd found, and they buried it." "Can you send me that memo?" "Already did. Check your email." Baker opened her laptop with shaking hands. The memo appeared on screen, typed on NSA letterhead, signed by an assistant director whose name had been redacted. One sentence leaped out at her. Analyst Baker's detection of 7.83 Hz modulation during combat operations confirmed successful field implementation of Project CW 12/7 parameters. Successful field implementation? They'd tested their radar spoofing technology using Liberty as an unwitting target, used it to make the ship appear and disappear on radar screens, creating confusion, creating plausible deniability for an attack that would destroy the evidence of the test itself. 34 Americans had died to protect a secret weapons program. But who had conducted the actual attack? Foreign forces used as unwitting proxies, unmarked US aircraft and vessels, mercenaries hired through intelligence cutouts. The memo didn't say. Perhaps that was the final layer of the secret, ensuring that even if the truth about sine wave emerged, no one could definitively prove who had pulled the triggers. Baker stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up the phone and called someone she thought she'd never contact again. Act 4. The recording. 2025, 8 years later. Washington, D.C. Evan Carter was 34 years old and tired of writing about budget hearings and committee appointments. for the Washington political blog that employed him. He'd gone into journalism to expose corruption, to hold power accountable. Instead, he spent his days rewriting press releases and attending briefings where nobody said anything real. Then a package arrived at his office with no return address, postmarked from Newport News, Virginia, home to the largest naval shipyard on the East Coast. Inside was a reel-to-reel tape in a waterproof bag, labelled in faded ink, Sine Wave Intercept 6867. Also inside, a typed note on yellowed paper. "Mr. Carter, you don't know me, but I know your work. This recording was made aboard USS Liberty during the attack on June 8th, 1967. I was told to destroy it. I couldn't. Before I die, someone should hear what really happened that day. Listen carefully. Look for Sine Wave. They're still using it. MR." Carter's first instinct was to throw it away. Anonymous packages, conspiracy theories about 50-year-old incidents. This was exactly the kind of rabbit hole that destroyed journalists' credibility. But curiosity won. He took the tape to an audio restoration specialist in Baltimore who digitized it for $200 and didn't ask questions. That night, Carter sat in his apartment with noise-cancelling headphones and pressed play. For the first minute, nothing but static and distant voices. Then clearer, military radio traffic, terse commands, acknowledgements. Someone was intercepting operational communications in real time. At timestamp 1413, an American voice cut through. "Shadow 7 to Cyan Control. Phase 2 parameters confirmed. Frequency modulation holding at 7.83 Hz. Standing by for sequence initiation." Carter stopped the playback, rewound it, listened again. American voice. American military radio protocol. Speaking about a phase sequence moments before the attack began. He kept listening. At 1416, the sound changed. Loud cracks, metallic impacts, screaming. The attack had begun. Through the chaos, another American voice, older, strained. "Cyan Control, this is Liberty Actual. We are under fire. We are a United States vessel. Cease fire! Cease fire!" That voice was familiar. Carter paused the recording and pulled up archival footage of Liberty survivors on YouTube. Commander William McGonigal, the ship's captain, giving testimony before Congress in 1982, the same voice. But according to all historical accounts, McGonigal had been on the bridge, fully exposed, with no radio equipment. He'd communicated through the bridge circuit, which had been destroyed in the first minutes of the attack, so how was he on this recording, speaking on a secure frequency that shouldn't have existed? Carter listened to the entire 75 minutes. The attack unfolded in real time. The aircraft, the torpedo boats, the screams, the chaos. And beneath it all, periodically cutting through, those calm American voices. Maintain visual lock, phase progression nominal, data collection continuing. At timestamp 1528, just before the attacking forces withdrew, one final transmission. Cyan Control to all stations, phase termination in 60 seconds, secure all data collection equipment. Shadow 7, confirm recording status. Recording complete, 73 minutes of continuous sensor data. Phase cancellation maintained throughout engagement. Excellent. Return to station. Operation Cyan Wave is concluded. Then silence. Carter sat in the darkness of his apartment, heart pounding. He just listened to evidence of a classified US military operation targeting one of its own ships. Not mistaken identity, not accidental friendly fire, a test. He needed verification. He needed someone who'd understand the technical implications, someone with intelligent community experience. He thought about that note's warning. They're still using it. Using what? Radar spoofing technology? This Cyan Wave system? Carter spent the next week researching. He found Linda Baker's name in declassified NSA documents about Liberty, one of the analysts who'd reviewed the intercepts. She'd be in her 90s now if she was still alive. A record search found her in Arlington, Virginia, age 94, still alive. He called her number. She answered on the fourth ring. "Mrs. Baker, my name is Evan Carter. I'm a journalist in Washington. I have a recording I think you need to hear." "What kind of recording?" "It's labelled Cyan Wave Intercept, from June 8th, 1967. The line went silent for so long Carter thought she'd hung up. "Come to my house tomorrow," Baker said finally. "Come alone, bring the recording." Arlington, Virginia, the next day. Linda Baker's home was a small ranch house in a quiet neighbourhood, the yard immaculately maintained, American flag on the porch. Carter knocked, and she answered immediately, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and hands gnarled by arthritis. "Mr. Carter, come in." Her living room was neat, military precise, walls covered with framed photographs. A younger Baker in the 1960s professional attire, posed with colleagues outside Fort Meade. Citations for distinguished service. A shadow box with medals. Carter set up his laptop and played the recording. Baker listened with her eyes closed, hands folded in her lap. When McGonagall's voice came through, "Scion Control, this is Liberty Actual," her eyes opened sharply. "That's not possible," she whispered. Carter paused the playback. "What's not possible?" "That voice. That's Commander McGonagall. I heard his testimony before Congress. But he couldn't have been transmitting on that frequency. The bridge communications were destroyed. Unless... Unless what?" Baker stood slowly and walked to a bookshelf. She removed a thick photo album and opened it, revealing not photographs but papers, decades-old documents, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. "I kept copies," she said. "Things I wasn't supposed to keep. Things I thought might matter someday." She showed Carter the 1967 memo referencing the 7.83 Hz frequency spikes, the budget document listing sine wave funding, the patent application for electromagnetic signature modulation. It was a test, Baker said. They were testing radar spoofing technology, making ships appear and disappear on radar screens by manipulating extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields. Liberty's sensors were sophisticated enough to detect it, to record it, so they had to eliminate the evidence. By attacking their own ship, by creating a plausible cover story, a regional conflict, mistaken identity, fog of war. The attackers, whoever they actually were, could claim confusion. The US government accepts the explanation to protect its weapons program. 34 dead sailors become classified collateral damage. Carter felt sick. But the recording, McGonagall's voice. How? Two possibilities, Baker said. Either there were two separate communication streams, one real, one for the test control, or the recording itself is partially fabricated. Someone created a comprehensive audio record of the operation for documentation purposes, splicing together real combat recordings with test control transmissions. Who would do that? The NSA, DARPA, the Office of Naval Intelligence. Any agency running a black budget program that needs to document results without creating discoverable evidence. Carter thought about the anonymous note. They're still using it. "Mrs. Baker, if this technology existed in 1967, what would it look like now? 58 years of development?" Baker smiled grimly. "Stealth technology, active radar cancellation, electronic warfare systems that can make fighter jets invisible, ships disappear, missiles appear where they aren't. Every major military on Earth now uses descendants of what they tested that day. Can you prove any of this? Not in a way that would hold up in court, not in a way that would force declassification. The people who ordered it are dead. The paper trail is fragments and redactions. All we have are patterns and implications." Carter gestured at his laptop. "We have this recording." "Do we? Where did it come from? Who sent it? Could be authentic. Could be disinformation designed to surface and be debunked, discrediting everyone who takes it seriously. That's how intelligence agencies protect secrets, not by hiding them, but by surrounding them with so much noise that the truth becomes indistinguishable from paranoia." They sat in silence. "What do I do with this?" Carter asked finally. "What every journalist does. You tell the story. You let people decide what they believe. But understand, if you publish this, you'll be attacked, called a conspiracy theorist. Your credibility will be questioned. Sources will dry up. And if the recording is real, if there really are people still using this technology, they won't be happy that you've exposed it." Carter looked at the old woman across from him, someone who'd kept these secrets for nearly 60 years, waiting for the right moment. "Why didn't you go public, back in 1967 or any time since?" "Because I wasn't brave enough," Baker said simply, "and because I wasn't sure it would matter. The world had moved on. The technology proliferated. What would exposing it accomplish except my own destruction? Then why help me now? Because I'm 94 years old and dying? Because 34 sailors deserve better than being written off as collateral damage in a mistaken identity incident? And because someone sent you that recording for a reason, maybe it's time for the truth. Act 5. The Modern Implication. 3 months later. Evan Carter published his story in The Atlantic. Operation Taiyan Wave. New evidence suggests USS Liberty attack was classified US weapons test. The response was immediate and polarised. Survivors of the Liberty attack and their families praised the article. Military historians debated its implications. Intelligence community veterans appeared on news programmes to denounce it as baseless speculation. The Pentagon declined to comment. Carter received death threats. He also received calls from 3 former NSA analysts who claimed they'd seen similar frequency anomalies in other classified operations from the Cold War era. None would go on record. 2 weeks after publication, Carter received a formal letter from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence requesting he turn over the original recording for authentication analysis. He declined through his lawyer, citing source protection. The story faded from the news cycle after a month. Some things are too old, too buried, too protected by institutional inertia to ever fully surface. But Carter kept digging. He found the patent Linda Baker had mentioned, US Patent 5159703. Method and apparatus for electromagnetic signature modulation. Filed in 1970, granted in 1992. The inventors, Richard Kellerman, Raytheon Advanced Systems, David Morse, DARPA Research Division, and Thomas Chen, Naval Research Laboratory. The patent described using extremely low-frequency electromagnetic pulses to create phase cancellation of radar return signals, making objects invisible to radar detection. Commercial application: stealth technology for military aircraft and naval vessels. The patent cited prior research from 1965 to 1967, but didn't name the project. Carter found academic papers from the 1980s and 90s discussing the Schumann resonance, that's 7.83 Hz frequency, and its potential military applications. Theoretical work on using Earth's natural electromagnetic field as a carrier signal for undetectable communications or radar manipulation. He found a 2003 Defense Advanced Research Project's agency request for proposals. Iron field stabilization, active phase defense systems for next-generation electronic warfare. The technology had never stopped developing. Whatever they tested on Liberty in 1967 had evolved into the cutting edge of modern military technology. The secret had been protected not just to avoid accountability for an attack, but to preserve a strategic advantage that was still relevant today. Arlington National Cemetery, November 2025. On a cold afternoon, 58 years after the attack, the US Navy unveiled a memorial plaque for the USS Liberty at Arlington National Cemetery. A small ceremony, attended by aging survivors, family members, and a handful of Navy officials. Linda Baker attended in a wheelchair, oxygen tank at her side. She watched as a Marine Honor Guard presented the colours, and a Navy chaplain offered prayers for the dead. When the ceremony ended, a man in civilian clothes approached her. Late 50s, grey suit, no identifying credentials. "Mrs. Baker? I'm with the Office of Naval Intelligence, thank you for attending." "Did you know them?" "The men who died?" "No, ma'am. Before my time, but I wanted to thank you personally." "For what?" "For your service. For your discretion over the years. For helping close an old file." Baker looked at him sharply. "I didn't close anything. That journalist's story is still out there." The man smiled. "Stories fade. Conspiracy theories multiply and discredit themselves. What matters is that the institutional memory remains consistent. Tragic accident. Mistaken identity. Fog of war. Some things are better left under the waterline where they belong." He handed her a business card, blank except for a phone number. "If you ever need anything, Mrs. Baker, the Navy takes care of its own." He walked away before she could respond. That night, Baker sat in her living room, too tired to sleep. She thought about Mark Reynolds, whoever he was now, whatever had happened to him. She thought about the men who died on liberty. She thought about all the secrets she'd kept and all the years that had passed. Her computer chimed. Incoming email. The sender address was a random string of characters, no subject line. She opened it. The message contained only 2 lines of text and an audio file attachment. Echo phase reactivated. Frequency 7.83 Hz detected. Eastern Med Array. Baker's hand trembled as she clicked the attachment. A waveform appeared on her screen. Audio data, time-stamped from the earlier that day. She plugged in her headphones and pressed play. At first, nothing. White noise. The hiss of distant ocean monitoring equipment. Then, gradually emerging from the background, a low rhythmic pulse. Steady. Measured. Precisely 7.83 Hz. The same frequency she detected 58 years ago. The pulse continued for 30 seconds, growing slightly louder, more distinct, and beneath it so faint she had to turn the volume to maximum. Something else. Not random noise. Pattern. Structure. Multiple voices overlapped and distorted, speaking in fragments. Phase alignment confirmed. Target lock acquired. Maintain visual until... Cyan control. Baker's breath caught. These weren't recordings from 1967. The audio quality was too clean, too digital. This was new, current, happening right now. She checked the timestamp again. November 15th, 2025, 1413 UTC. The exact same time the Liberty attack had begun, 58 years earlier, 1413 local time in the Eastern Mediterranean. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. Someone was running the system again, in the same location, at the same time, either as a test, a demonstration, or an actual operation. The audio file continued playing. The pulse grew stronger, more insistent, until it began to synchronize with something else. A deeper rhythm, slower, familiar. It took her a moment to recognize it. A heartbeat. Human heartbeat rhythm. Approximately 60 beats per minute. The electromagnetic pulse was modulating to match it, as if the technology itself had evolved to interface with biological rhythms, making it harder to distinguish from natural background noise. The sound built, layering upon itself, electromagnetic pulse, human heartbeat, those fragmented voices, all blending into a single resonant frequency that made Baker's chest feel tight, her own heart seeming to synchronize with the rhythm coming through her headphones. At exactly 60 seconds, the audio cut out. Silence. Baker sat frozen, headphones still on, staring at her computer screen. The email had already disappeared from her inbox. She checked her deleted folder, her spam folder. Nothing. As if it had never existed. But the audio file was still on her desktop, and she tried to open it again. The file was corrupted, 0 bytes, unreadable. Someone had sent her evidence of an active operation and then remotely erased it, leaving her with nothing but memory and the knowledge that after 58 years, Cyan Wave wasn't history. It was still operational, still secret, still being used somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean at this very moment. Baker closed her laptop and sat in the darkness of her living room. Outside, a cold November wind rattled the windows. The American flag on her porch snapped and rippled. She thought about those 34 sailors, about Mark Reynolds and his stolen tape, about Commander McGonagall standing on that bridge refusing to abandon his post, even as his ship was destroyed around him. She thought about all the secrets she'd kept, all the years of silence and whether any of it had mattered. Her phone sat on the table beside her. She could call Carter, tell him about the email, the audio, the active signal, but what would that accomplish? Another story that would be denied, debunked, dismissed. Or she could do nothing, let it go, die with her secrets intact, having spent her whole life in the shadows of classified operations. Baker picked up the phone. She dialed Carter's number. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Baker, are you okay? It's almost midnight." "Mr. Carter," she said quietly, "they're running it again. Right now, same location, same time. I just received proof." "Received from who?" "I don't know. Someone who wants me to know, or wants to see what I'll do with the information." "Do you still have the proof?" "No. It erased itself, but I heard it, Evan, that frequency, those voices. It's not historical, it's active, right now. Carter was silent for a moment. What do you want me to do? I want you to keep digging. Keep asking questions. Don't let them bury it for another 58 years. Those men deserve better. The truth deserves better. And you? What will you do? Baker looked at the blank business card from the ONI officer, still sitting on her coffee table. I'm going to make a phone call, she said. I'm going to tell them I know. And then I'm going to sleep better than I have in 58 years. They might... I'm 94 years old and dying of cancer, Evan. What are they going to do? The only power they have over me is silence. And I'm done being silent. She hung up before he could argue. Baker sat for a long time, holding that blank business card, thinking about consequences and courage and the weight of truth. Finally, at 12:47 a.m, she dialed the number. It rang once. A voice answered. Male, neutral, professional. Yes? This is Linda Baker. Someone wanted me to know that sine wave is still active. I'm calling to tell you that I know. I've always known. And now someone else knows too. Silence on the line then. Mrs. Baker, I think you may be confused. Perhaps. I'm not confused. I was there from the beginning. I saw the frequency data. I kept the documents. And tonight I heard the same pulse, live, from the Eastern Mediterranean. You can deny it, classify it, bury it under 50 more years of secrecy, but you can't stop the truth from eventually surfacing. Another pause. When the voice returned, it was colder. The truth, Mrs. Baker, is complicated. National security requires difficult decisions. Sometimes the greater good demands sacrifice. Tell that to the 34 men who died. Their sacrifice advanced American defensive capabilities that have protected thousands of lives since. Would you undo that? I would have found another way. One that didn't require killing our own sailors. There was no other way. And if you truly believed what you're saying, you would have gone public decades ago. But you didn't. Because you understand the necessity of secrets. Baker closed her eyes. He was right. She'd had 58 years to speak. She'd chosen silence. Until now. You're right, she said softly. I should have spoken sooner. But I can end my life having finally told the truth. Sine wave happened. It's still happening. And people deserve to know. No one will believe you without proof. And you have none. Maybe. But I'm not the only one who knows anymore. And eventually secrets always surface. Good night, Mrs. Baker. Thank you for your service. The line went dead. Baker set down the phone and exhaled slowly. Her heart was racing. She felt more alive than she had in years. She'd done it. Finally, after all this time, she'd confronted the people who'd buried the truth for 6 decades. Outside, a car started somewhere on her street. Engine noise, headlights briefly washing across her windows, then darkness again. If they were watching, let them watch. She'd said what needed to be said. Baker went to bed and slept deeply for the first time in 58 years. Epilogue. 6 months later, May 2026. Linda Baker died peacefully in her sleep on May 3rd, 2026 at the age of 94. Her obituary in the Washington Post mentioned her distinguished career at the National Security Agency and her contributions to signals intelligence during the Cold War. It did not mention USS Liberty or Sine Wave. Evan Carter attended her funeral in Arlington. A military honor guard was present. Several elderly former NSA colleagues paid their respects. The ONI officer in the grey suit stood in the back, watching. After the service, Carter found a manila envelope on his car windshield, secured under the wiper blade. Inside, a USB drive and a handwritten note in Linda Baker's shaky script, dated 2 weeks before her death. Mr. Carter, if you're reading this, I'm gone. Enclosed is everything I kept over the years. Documents, audio files, analysis. Use your judgment. Some truths are worth the cost, some aren't. You'll have to decide. But decide honestly. Don't let fear make the choice for you. Those sailors died for a secret. Make sure their deaths meant something. LB. Carter plugged the USB drive into his laptop that night. Hundreds of files. Scanned documents from the 1960s and 70s. audio recordings, technical analyses, Linda Baker's complete archive of everything she'd learned about Operation Cyan Wave. At the bottom of the directory, one video file for Evan.mp4. He clicked it. Linda Baker appeared on screen, sitting in her living room, clearly unwell but sharp-eyed. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 3 days before her death. "Hello, Evan," she said. "If you're watching this, I kept my promise to myself. I died having told the truth. Everything on this drive is real. Cyan Wave existed. It was tested on Liberty. 34 men died to protect it, and it's still being used today. You have a choice now. Publish this and face the consequences, or put it away and let the secret stay buried. I can't tell you what to do. But I can tell you this. Those sailors didn't have a choice. They were sacrificed by people who saw them as expendable. The least we owe them is the truth. Whatever you decide, thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for giving an old woman the courage to finally do the right thing." She smiled sadly. "Good luck, Evan. The truth is a heavy burden, but it's the only thing worth carrying." The video ended. Carter sat in silence, the weight of decision pressing down on him. Outside, Washington, D.C. hummed with the machinery of government, agencies and institutions and classified programs operating in shadows, protecting secrets that might be vital or might be criminal. He thought about Linda Baker, about Mark Reynolds, about Commander McGonagall and 34 sailors who died in the Mediterranean. He thought about truth and consequences, about secrecy and accountability. Then he opened a new document and began to write. The title appeared, Operation Cyan Wave, The Complete Story. Whether he would publish it, whether the world would ever read it, whether the truth would be more than fragments and implications, that remained uncertain. But at least now someone knew. Someone had listened. Someone was carrying the burden forward, and somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, at precisely 14:13 local time, a low-frequency pulse cycled through the electromagnetic spectrum at 7.83 Hz, detected by satellites and monitoring stations, part of a system that had never stopped evolving, never stopped operating, never stopped echoing across the decades since that June afternoon in 1967. The sound built, layered with meaning and memory. It matched a human heartbeat. It faded into silence, and the world moved on, carrying its secrets, waiting for the day when truth would surface, not as conspiracy but as history, when those 34 sailors would receive something more than a memorial plaque, waiting for the echoes to finally be heard. Before we begin tonight, a quick thank you to everyone who left a comment suggesting Sedona as a topic. You asked for this one, and honestly, the deeper we went into the research, the more we understood why. This one is something else, and if you have a moment after listening, please leave us a review on Spotify. It genuinely takes about 10 seconds, and it means the world to this channel. Every single review helps new listeners find us now. Let's talk about Sedona. There are places on this earth that seem to exist at the edge of the explainable. Places where the light bends differently, where the silence feels loaded, where the rocks themselves seem to watch you. Sedona, Arizona is one of those places, carved from ancient volcanic stone into formations of deep burnt red and amber. It rises from the high desert floor like something that was built rather than grown. A cathedral of geology, patient and enormous, older than almost anything a human being can name, and, for decades, long before the tour buses arrived and the crystal shops opened and the vortex maps were printed and sold, something strange was happening in the sky above those red rocks. Something that was noticed, something that was documented, something that was, in the end, very carefully not talked about. Tonight, we follow that thread. We go back to the late 1980s, when the first clusters of reports began to surface. We examine the pattern that emerged over the following decades, the repeated sightings, the identical descriptions from independent witnesses, the gaps in official data that should not exist, and the slow, methodical work of one investigative journalist who began to suspect that Sedona was not simply a strange place where strange things happened by accident. We follow his conclusion that Sedona may be a monitored zone, a location where something experimental, extraterrestrial, or something we don't have a clean category for yet, has been appearing with consistency for more than 40 years, and where the official response has been not investigation, but containment. This is the story of the Sedona Zone. Act 1. The sightings begin to understand what Sedona became. You first have to understand what it was. For most of the 20th century, Sedona, Arizona was a small, quiet town. A collection of motels, a few art galleries, a population of a few thousand people who had chosen remoteness over convenience. The surrounding landscape was dramatic, certainly, but drama in the American Southwest is not unusual. Red Rock Country stretches across Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona in vast and humbling arrangements. Sedona was beautiful. It was not famous. That began to change in the 1970s and early 80s, when a loose network of New Age spiritual practitioners began identifying what they called vortex sites around the town, specific geographic locations where they believed the Earth emitted unusual energy fields, where meditation felt different, where the body felt charged or heavy or unburdened in ways that resisted easy description. Bell Rock, Cathedral Rock, Airport Mesa, Boynton Canyon. These were the sites most frequently cited. They were also, coincidentally or not, the sites that would become the most consistently associated with the aerial phenomena reports that followed. But in the early 1980s, that connection had not yet been made. The vortex idea was spiritual tourism. The aerial phenomena were something separate, and something that most people in Sedona either hadn't seen yet, or weren't yet talking about openly. By the middle of the decade, that changed. The first documented clusters of sightings in and around Sedona began appearing in local newspapers sometime around 1986 and 1987. The reports were varied in their details, but consistent in their core descriptions. Witnesses reported glowing orbs, typically white or amber or pale blue, moving silently through the night sky at altitudes that were difficult to estimate. They moved slowly, then stopped. Some hovered in place for minutes at a time. Some changed direction without any visible arc or deceleration, the kind of instantaneous course correction that no aircraft in civilian or military inventory was publicly known to be capable of. Some simply vanished. Not faded, not flew away. Vanished, as though a switch had been thrown. Local radio stations began receiving calls. The Sedona Red Rock News and similar regional publications ran brief mentions, generally framed with the cautious skepticism that newspapers apply to any topic that risks their credibility. Flares, they said. Helicopters from nearby military ranges. Atmospheric reflections off the rock formations on clear, cold desert nights. These were reasonable explanations, and for a time they were accepted. But the frequency was increasing. That was the thing that the standard explanations couldn't fully account for. Flares happen in clusters. Helicopters have schedules. Atmospheric anomalies are irregular by nature. What was happening in Sedona was neither irregular nor explained by schedules. It was consistent, and in the years that followed, it would become more so. Act 2. The pattern takes shape. Between 1990 and 1993, the reports coming out of Sedona began to attract a different kind of attention. Not from government agencies or official investigators, not publicly anyway, but from within the community of people who took such reports seriously. Civilian researchers, amateur astronomers, members of loosely organised UFO investigation networks that had been operating since the 1950s. They came to Sedona, talked to witnesses, set up cameras, and what they found surprised even them. The witnesses, and there were many by this point, dozens in the immediate Sedona area and more in the surrounding towns of Cottonwood, Cornville, and the Verde Valley, were describing not just similar phenomena, but identical phenomena. 3 lights forming a triangle. That description appeared again and again in report after report, from witnesses who had no contact with each other, who had submitted their accounts independently, who in several cases were unaware that anyone else had reported anything similar. 3 lights in a triangular arrangement, moving slowly, silently, then accelerating upward with a speed that witnesses consistently described as impossible. Not fast, impossible. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, and the sky was empty. A retired aviation technician who had spent 20 years working with military aircraft at Tucson's Davis-Monthan Air Force Base reviewed several witness accounts at the request of a civilian researcher in 1992. His assessment was direct. He said that based on the described behaviour, the silence, the instantaneous acceleration, the hovering stability, none of it matched anything in the known American arsenal at that time. He was careful not to speculate beyond that. He simply said, that wasn't anything we had in the skies back then. 5 words that carry an enormous amount of weight when they come from someone who spent 2 decades surrounded by the things that actually were in the skies back then. Arizona as a whole was becoming a hotspot. Sightings in Prescott, reports near the Mogollon Rim, strange lights over the White Mountains, and then, in March of 1997, an event that would force the entire conversation into the national media, the Phoenix Lights. Thousands of witnesses across a corridor stretching from the Nevada border to the outskirts of Tucson reported a massive, silent V-shaped formation of lights moving slowly across the sky. The governor of Arizona made jokes about it on television. The military said flares, the witnesses, among them, commercial pilots, police officers, and physicians, said otherwise. The Phoenix Lights became the most widely witnessed mass UFO event in American history, and it happened in Arizona, in the same region, in the same sky, where the Sedona reports had been accumulating for a decade. That was not lost on the people who were paying attention. Act 3. The official explanation. Let us give the official position its due. Arizona is, without question, one of the most militarily active states in the American Southwest. The United States Air Force operates Luke Air Force Base just outside Phoenix, where fighter pilots have been trained for decades, where the skies above the desert are routinely occupied by aircraft performing manoeuvres that a casual observer on the ground might reasonably find difficult to explain. Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Fort Huachuca south of Tucson. The Barry M. Goldwater Range, an enormous military operating area stretching across the southwestern corner of the state, where live-fire exercises and experimental flight tests take place on a regular basis. Arizona's vast, flat, sparsely populated desert makes it ideal for military aviation. More training, more testing, more flying happens in that sky than in almost any comparable geography in the country. This is genuinely relevant. It is not a fabrication designed to dismiss public concern. Military aircraft do strange things. Experimental prototypes behave in ways that defy easy categorization from the ground. Flares dropped at altitude in still air can appear to hover. Classified programs produce classified aircraft, and classified aircraft, by definition, cannot be publicly acknowledged even when they are observed. The Air Force's public explanation for the vast majority of Arizona sightings, training exercises, experimental aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, flares, is not inherently dishonest. It is, in many specific cases, almost certainly accurate. The problem is not any single explanation. The problem is the pattern of explanation. Because the template was the same every time. Reports emerge, witnesses speak publicly, a brief media cycle follows. The military or the FAA issues a statement. Terse, confident, conclusive. The media cycle ends. No follow-up investigation, no formal interview of witnesses, no acknowledgement that the reports had been received or were being evaluated. Just the statement and then silence. Case closed, publicly. And in the space of that silence, the questions accumulated. Because if all of these events were explained by known military operations, why were there no corroborating records? Why were the training schedules not released to confirm the timing? Why did the explanations consistently arrive quickly and leave no room for the possibility that anything unexplained had occurred, even when the witnesses included professionals with expert knowledge of aviation who were saying, on the record, that the explanations didn't hold up? The official position was not wrong necessarily, but it was incurious in a way that felt deliberate, and it was that incuriosity that caught the attention of Daniel Reyes. Act 4. The Investigator. Daniel Reyes was not a UFO enthusiast. That is important to understand. He was an investigative journalist who had spent most of his career covering land use disputes in the American Southwest, water rights litigation, the complicated politics of federal land management in states where the federal government controls enormous percentages of the total land area. He had covered stories that required him to read FAA documents, Department of Defense reports, Bureau of Land Management filings, and the dense bureaucratic language that federal agencies use to describe their activities in the regions they control. He was, in other words, fluent in the kind of paper trail that most people have neither the training nor the patience to follow. He came to Sedona, not as a believer, but as a reporter. A contact had mentioned the consistency of the long-term sighting reports, and Reyes, whose journalistic instinct was to follow patterns rather than individual incidents, drove out to the Red Rock country on a Tuesday afternoon in the late 1990s with a notebook and no particular expectation. He expected to find enthusiastic locals, a few dramatic stories, and a collection of photographs that could have been anything. He expected, in other words, to find nothing that would hold up under scrutiny. What he found instead was the airspace anomaly. Reyes was methodical. Before he talked to a single witness, he sat down with FAA sectional charts for the Sedona area, the kind of detailed airspace maps that pilots use to navigate controlled and restricted airspace. What he saw surprised him. Sedona sits within a complex airspace environment. The Phoenix Terminal Control Area extends considerably to the south and east. Military. Operations areas and restricted zones are distributed across the region in overlapping layers. The geometry of controlled airspace around Sedona is, to put it plainly, unusual for an area with no major commercial airport and a relatively small civilian population. There were corridors and intersections and transition zones that, to Reyes's eye, suggested something more deliberate than the organic growth of airspace management around civilian aviation needs. And then he requested the radar data. For the sighting-heavy years of the early 1990s, 1990, 91, 92, Reyes submitted formal requests for publicly accessible radar records covering the Sedona area. What he received was incomplete, not missing entirely, not obviously redacted, simply incomplete. Gaps in the data. Periods of minutes or sometimes longer where the record simply didn't exist, where the timestamp jumped and the log continued as though nothing had happened in the interval. Reyes requested clarification. He received a response that cited data storage limitations of the era, equipment maintenance schedules, and a note that complete records for many rural areas from that period were not retained in accessible archives. The response was professionally worded, bureaucratically impeccable, and thoroughly unsatisfying. Because Reyes, being thorough, had also requested radar data from comparable rural areas in the same region for the same time period, and those records were complete. Act 5. The Witnesses. With the paperwork questions unresolved and the airspace anomaly documented in his notes, Reyes turned to the witnesses. He had expected this part of the investigation to be the least reliable. Anecdotes are by nature subjective, and the literature on eyewitness testimony is not encouraging about its accuracy under normal conditions, let alone conditions involving unusual stimuli in dark desert skies. He had built in a significant discount for the human tendency to pattern match and dramatise. What he encountered shrank that discount considerably. He tracked down long-term residents, people who had lived in and around Sedona for decades. He found retired school teachers and former rangers and small business owners, people with no particular investment in the subject, no books to sell, no reputations built on being witnesses. He interviewed them separately, without sharing details from other accounts, taking careful notes about what they described before asking any follow-up questions that might have prompted them toward particular answers. The consistency was, in Reyes's own words, uncomfortable. Independent witnesses describing events separated by years, sometimes by a decade or more, produced accounts that aligned in their core details with a precision that pure coincidence could not comfortably explain. The triangular formation of lights appeared in accounts from the late 1980s, from the middle of the 1990s, from the early 2000s. The same formation, the same silence, the same behaviour, slow approach, sustained hover, instantaneous departure, different witnesses, different nights, different years, same description. And perhaps most striking of all, the same locations. Bell Rock, the area above and around Cathedral Rock, the corridor between Airport Mesa and Boynton Canyon. These were not random points scattered across the sky. These were specific sites, and across 4 decades of reports, they appeared with a frequency that suggested not randomness, but pattern. One witness, a former tour guide who had been leading hikes through the Sedona Red Rocks for almost 25 years, told Reyes something that stayed with him. She said, it wasn't random. They came back to the same spots. She had seen the lights herself on 3 separate occasions spanning more than a decade. Each time, the location was the same. Each time, the behaviour was the same. And she was clear that she wasn't speaking metaphorically or emotionally. She was describing an observable, repeatable geographic fact. The same spots, over and over again, across a span of time that no training exercise or weather event or optical illusion could plausibly account for. Reyes sat with that for a long time. ACT-Zix. The Vortex Correspondence. There is a moment in any serious investigation when you encounter a piece of information that you would rather not take seriously, because taking it seriously requires you to revise assumptions you were fairly comfortable with. For Reyes, that moment came when he mapped the sighting locations against Sedona's famous vortex sites. Sedona's vortex sites are officially a spiritual concept. The claim, made by New Age practitioners beginning in the 1970s, is that certain geographic locations around Sedona emit unusual energetic fields that can be felt by people who are sufficiently attuned to them. Bell Rock, Cathedral Rock, Airport Mesa, Boynton Canyon. These are the 4 most commonly cited vortex locations. They attract hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, many of whom report experiences they describe as powerful, disorienting, emotionally charged, or physically strange. The scientific community does not endorse the concept of vortex energy. No confirmed, reproducible physical measurement of any unusual energy field at these sites has been published in a peer-reviewed context. The vortex designation is, in the scientific consensus, a cultural phenomenon rather than a physical one. Reyes accepted that consensus. He was not investigating the vortexes, he was investigating aerial phenomena. But when he plotted the geographic coordinates of the most frequently reported sighting locations on a map, and then overlaid Sedona's documented vortex sites, the correspondence was not subtle. The majority of sighting reports, not some, not a plurality, but the clear majority, clustered within a few miles of one or more of the 4 primary vortex locations. Bell Rock appeared at the centre of an extraordinary concentration of reports. Cathedral Rock was second. The spatial overlap between the sighting cluster map and the vortex site map was precise enough that it could not be easily dismissed as coincidence. Reyes was careful about what to make of this. He did not conclude that the vortexes were real in the New Age sense, or that energy fields were attracting or enabling whatever was appearing in the sky. But he noted, and he noted it at length, that the overlap was consistent, that across decades of independent reports from witnesses who were not in communication with each other, and who were not, for the most part, participants in vortex tourism, the geographic pattern held. Something about those specific locations kept appearing in the data, whatever it meant scientifically, or didn't mean, it was a fact of the record, and facts of the record Reyes believed deserved to be followed. He began to develop a theory. It started, as his best theories always did, with a question. What do these specific locations have in common? Not spiritually, geologically. Act 7. The Contact Zone Hypothesis. Sedona's geology is extraordinary by any measure. The red rock formations that define its landscape, the buttes, mesas, spires, and canyons that rise from the high desert floor in shapes that seem too deliberate, too architectural to be purely natural, are composed primarily of Schneebly Hill sandstone, a formation laid down approximately 300 million years ago in what was then a shallow sea. Layered on top of that are formations of Coconino sandstone, Torowep limestone, and Kaibab limestone. The red coloration that gives the rocks their dramatic appearance and their name comes from iron oxide, rust, essentially, bound into the sedimentary matrix. It is an iron-rich landscape in a profound and measurable sense. Iron is electrically conductive. Concentrated iron-bearing rock formations can produce localized variations in magnetic field strength. This is not speculative. It is measurable geophysics, documented in multiple studies of mineralogically active regions around the world. Whether the variations at Sedona's specific vortex sites are large enough to affect radio frequency propagation, radar return characteristics, or the behaviour of electronic systems at altitude is a different question, and one that Reyes, not a geophysicist, was careful not to answer definitively. But he noted the possibility. He noted that certain researchers in the field of geomagnetic anomaly study had flagged the Sedona Basin as an area of unusual magnetic signature. He noted that the relationship between electromagnetic terrain and radar reliability is well documented in other military contexts, that certain types of geological formations can create interference zones, shadow zones, areas where radar coverage is degraded or where ground clutter returns complicate the picture. And he asked the question that gave his theory its shape. What if the geographic concentration of sightings around specific Sedona locations was not coincidental or mystical but electromagnetic? What if something about those specific geological formations created conditions, reduced radar visibility, specific electromagnetic characteristics, unusual propagation environments that made them attractive to whatever was appearing in the sky? Either because those conditions allowed unknown aerial vehicles to operate with reduced detection risk, or because those conditions were what the vehicles were responding to in the first place. This was the contact zone hypothesis. In Reyes's formulation, Sedona was not merely a place where strange things happened to occur. It was a location with specific physical properties that made it predictable, a reliable geography that, for reasons that might be electromagnetic or navigational or something we don't have adequate instruments to measure, consistently attracted or enabled the phenomena being reported. Not a spiritual vortex, not a mystical convergence, a physical anomaly zone, one that could be mapped, tracked and monitored. And if it could be monitored by Reyes with publicly available geological and airspace data, then it had almost certainly been monitored by agencies with access to far more complete information long before he arrived. Act 8. The response pattern. Reyes spent several months comparing the Sedona incident record against other documented UFO hotspots across the United States. He looked at the Hudson Valley sightings of the 1980s, which produced hundreds of credible reports of large, silent triangular craft over New York and Connecticut over a span of years. He looked at the Yakima Indian Reservation in Washington state, where a long-serving fire lookout named Bill Vogel had, documented hundreds of anomalous light events over multiple decades beginning in the 1970s. He looked at the Marfa lights in West Texas, the Hessdalen lights in Norway, the Gulf Breeze events in Florida, and the long record of unusual aerial activity over the Pine Bush area of New York's Hudson Valley. Each location had its own specific character. Each had a different set of reported phenomena, a different geographic context, a different community of witnesses. But the official response to each of them followed a template so consistent that Reyes began to think of it less as a coincidence and more as a protocol. The template worked like this. Initial reports would surface in local media. Witnesses would come forward. A brief period of public attention would follow, sometimes drawing national media interest if the reports were dramatic enough or the witness credentials were sufficiently compelling. Then an official statement would appear from the Air Force, the FAA, a local law enforcement agency, or some combination of official voices, providing a definitive explanation. The explanation was always mundane: flares, weather balloons, natural gas, military exercises, lens flare, temperature inversions, conventional aircraft. The explanation was delivered with the confident finality of an institution that has investigated thoroughly and found nothing remarkable, and then the investigation stopped. Officially, no follow-up, no public disclosure of what investigation, if any, had actually been conducted. No formal response to the witnesses who disputed the official explanation. No acknowledgement that the phenomena had occurred with sufficient consistency to warrant ongoing study. Just the statement, the explanation, and the silence. Reyes documented this template across a dozen locations spanning 4 decades. The similarities were not incidental. They suggested to him not a coordinated conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not men in dark suits, making telephone calls in the night, but something more institutional and more mundane. A policy. A default response pattern that had been established at some point, for some reason, and was being applied consistently across a wide range of situations that shared certain characteristics. A policy that prioritized the appearance of explanation over the substance of investigation. He began to think about why such a policy might exist, and that led him to a retired defense contractor named Martin. Act 9. The retired officer, Martin, Reyes used only his first name in his published account, and we will respect that, was in his late 60s when Reyes found him, living quietly in a small town in the White Mountains of Arizona, about 2 hours east of Sedona. He had worked for a defense contractor that held federal contracts in the Southwest during the 1980s and 1990s, doing work he described broadly as involving analysis of aerial surveillance data for military clients. He was not an aviator. He was not a scientist. He was an analyst, someone who processed and interpreted data, who was paid to look at information and make sense of it. He agreed to speak with Reyes on the condition that certain specifics would not be published. The name of the contractor, the exact nature of his work, the specific clients he served. Reyes agreed to these conditions. What Martin was willing to say, he said carefully, and with the particular economy of someone who has spent years in an environment where saying the wrong thing has real consequences. He confirmed, first, that the aerial phenomena occurring in the Arizona region during the years of his employment had been noted by the agencies and contractors he worked with. This was not breaking news in any dramatic sense. It would be more surprising if professional analysts of aerial surveillance data had somehow failed to notice what hundreds of civilian witnesses were, observing and reporting. But it mattered that he confirmed it, because it ruled out one of the more comfortable dismissive explanations, that the official agencies simply hadn't seen anything because there was nothing to see. They had seen it. They were aware of it. And they had, Martin said, categorized it. Certain regions, he explained, and Sedona was among the examples he offered, had been internally designated as what he called low visibility zones. His description of what that meant was careful, and, to Reyes, telling. These were areas where unusual aerial activity had been observed, documented, and then placed in a category that did not trigger standard intercept or engagement protocols. The activity was monitored, it was logged, but it was not engaged. It was watched from a distance, and the watching was kept internal. Observation, not engagement. That was the phrase he remembered. Observation, not engagement. He said it was used when the subject of these zones came up, internally. He didn't know what it meant strategically. He wasn't in those meetings. He wasn't at that level. But he remembered the phrase because it was unusual. You didn't hear that kind of framing in normal operational contexts. It implied a deliberate choice not to act, and a deliberate choice not to act implies an awareness of what you're choosing not to act on. Reyes pressed him on what the entities being observed might have been. Martin was clear that he did not know. He was an analyst working with specific data sets, not someone with access to classified assessments or theoretical frameworks for what was being observed. He had opinions, naturally. Everyone who works around these things develops opinions, but he offered them as exactly that, and declined to have his opinions published as facts. What he offered as a fact was the protocol. Observe and do not engage. Watch and do not confirm. Log and do not publicise. Reyes left that interview in the White Mountains and drove back towards Sedona in the dark, through the ponderosa pines and the high desert scrub, with the phrase turning over in his mind. Observation, not engagement. It implied something being observed that was significant enough to monitor continuously, for decades, across multiple locations, without any public acknowledgement that the monitoring was happening. It implied, if you followed the logic to its conclusion, that the agencies responsible for American airspace had made a determination about what they were observing. Not that it was explainable and uninteresting, but that it was complex enough that engaging with it or publicising it was not the preferred course of action. That was a different kind of secret from the ones people usually imagine. Act 10. The Satellite Gap. Reyes spent the better part of a year after his conversation with Martin attempting to find corroborating evidence for the low visibility zone framework through publicly accessible channels. He was not trying to prove extraterrestrial contact. That was never his thesis. He was trying to establish whether the monitoring protocol Martin had described left any detectable footprint in the official record. The satellite data was his most productive avenue. Through the Freedom of Information Act and through contact with civilian researchers who had spent years navigating the same bureaucratic corridors, Reyes gained access to catalogues of available satellite tracking data for the Sedona area going back to the late 1980s. What he was looking for was coverage gaps, periods where the data record was incomplete or absent during the years, and at the times when the highest concentrations of sighting reports had occurred. He found them. Not in every case, and not in a pattern so clean that it could only have one interpretation, but in a frequency that was difficult to dismiss. Specific nights in the early 1990s, nights that corresponded when Reyes cross-referenced against the civilian sighting records he had assembled, with periods of unusually high reported activity, showed incomplete satellite tracking records for the Sedona region. The data existed up to a point, and then it did not exist, and then it resumed. Gaps. Not long ones in most cases, minutes sometimes, but consistent in their timing, consistent in their geographic specificity. The official explanation, when Reyes sought one, was exactly what it had been for the radar data. Storage limitations of the era, record-keeping practices of the time did not always ensure complete archiving. Rural and low-traffic areas were lower priority for data retention. This was a plausible explanation. Data management in the early 1990s was genuinely imperfect, and gaps in records from that period exist for any number of ordinary reasons. But Reyes had done his comparative research. He had pulled equivalent records for comparable areas, similar geographic, character, similar distance from major population centres, similar levels of official aerial activity, from the same time period. Those records were not complete in every case, but their gaps did not correspond to high activity periods. They were distributed across time in the way that technical failures distribute themselves, without pattern, without timing correlation, without the particular quality of appearing at precisely the moments when, according to independent civilian observers, something unusual was happening in the sky. A gap in data that corresponds to a period of unusual reported activity is not proof of anything. Reyes never claimed it was, but it is a fact of the record that raises a specific and uncomfortable question. If the gaps are genuinely random technical artifacts, why do they cluster where and when they do? And if they are not random, what does that mean about the process by which records for those specific moments became unavailable? Act 11. The controlled narrative. By the time Reyes assembled his findings into a coherent framework, he had moved away from the question that drives most UFO investigation. He was not trying to answer whether the objects being seen over Sedona were extraterrestrial. He had concluded early in the process that this question was both unanswerable, with the evidence available, and, in a certain sense, beside the point. What interested him was the response, not what was in the sky. What happened on the ground when people reported seeing it? His conclusion was this: Sedona represented a location where three things intersected in an unusual way. The first was natural geography, geological formations with electromagnetic properties that created a measurably unusual environment for aerial operations, radar propagation, and possibly other physical phenomena that we understand imperfectly. The second was military activity, the proximity to multiple major Air Force installations, the complex airspace geometry, the possibility that some percentage of what was being observed was indeed experimental or classified military technology operating in a region that offered natural cover in the form of remote terrain and convenient official explanations. The third was something else, a residual category of phenomena that fit neither natural atmospheric explanation nor known military technology, that had been reported by credible witnesses with consistent specificity across 4 decades, and that had been the subject of official monitoring protocols that were not publicly acknowledged. The intersection of these three things created what Reyes called a controlled narrative environment. When sightings were reported, the military activity explanation was available and credible, because military activity genuinely did occur in the region. When the military activity explanation was applied, it covered not just the sightings it legitimately explained, but also the sightings it didn't. The residual category, the third element, the presence of genuine explicable phenomena, provided cover for the discussion of phenomena that weren't explicable by the same means, and the consistent application of official explanation, followed by official silence, ensured that the residual category never accumulated enough public attention to force a more detailed reckoning. This was not, in Reyes's analysis, a conspiracy in the Hollywood sense. It was not a group of individuals consciously deciding to deceive the public about alien contact. It was something more institutional and, in a way, more troubling, a default preference for the appearance of explanation over the reality of uncertainty. A bureaucratic tendency to close files rather than leave them open, to apply the available explanation rather than acknowledge that the available explanation was incomplete, not malice, not a cover-up of a specific discovered truth. Something closer to a systematic avoidance of a question that nobody in an official position wanted to be the one responsible for answering. Because to answer it honestly would require acknowledging something that official institutions are structurally ill-equipped to acknowledge, that there are things happening in the sky over American territory that we have been observing for decades, that our best explanations do not fully account for, and that we have chosen, as a matter of institutional policy, to describe as explained rather than to describe as unknown. An unknown is, for a certain kind of institution, the most dangerous word in the lexicon. Act 12. The last question. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds certain subjects in official discourse. It is not the silence of ignorance, of agencies and institutions that genuinely have no information. It is the silence of awareness that has been converted, through a combination of policy and preference and institutional inertia, into the performance of ignorance. It is the silence of the file that was opened and then closed without notation, the record that exists somewhere in an archive that will not be easily accessed, the conversation in a conference room somewhere in the Arizona desert in the early 1990s where someone looked at a map with a cluster of data points around Bell Rock and said, "Observation, not engagement. Let's see what it does." If Sedona is a monitored anomaly zone, if the contact zone hypothesis is correct in its essential outline, then the monitoring has been ongoing for the better part of half a century. That means that somewhere, in some form, there is a record. Not necessarily a record that says aliens, almost certainly not a record that says that, but a record that acknowledges the anomaly, that documents the consistency of the phenomena, that catalogues 40 plus years of something appearing over the red rocks of northern Arizona and behaving in ways that the available explanations cannot fully account for. And if such a record exists, if the phenomena are real, and the monitoring is real, and the low visibility zone designation is real, then the question that Reyes found himself returning to at the end of his investigation was not the question most people would expect. It wasn't. Are UFOs real? It wasn't. Are we alone? These felt, to him, like the wrong level of abstraction. The question that the Sedona data raised, with its 4 decades of consistent reports, its identical witness descriptions, its same geographic locations appearing again and again across the full span of the record, was something more specific and, in a way, more unsettling. Why do they keep coming back to the same place? Because if the phenomena are real, and if they have been returning to the same geographic coordinates for 40 years, then whatever is happening in Sedona is not random. It is not accidental. It is not the kind of thing that can be explained by atmospheric quirks or military schedules or the human tendency to find patterns in noise. Something has been drawn to that specific stretch of red rock desert, repeatedly and consistently, across a span of time that encompasses enormous changes in the surrounding world. The town has grown, the roads have improved, the tourism industry has transformed the local economy, the population has quadrupled, satellite coverage of the region has become comprehensive, the sky above Sedona is more observed now, in more ways, than at any previous point in human history. And the sightings have continued. Not at the pace of the peak years, perhaps, not with the dramatic frequency of the early 1990s, but they continue. Visitors standing on Bell Rock at dusk, hoping for a spiritual experience, look up and see something moving in a way that the available aircraft in the sky do not move. Long-term residents who have seen the sky above these formations for decades describe encounters that they can't account for and mostly don't discuss publicly anymore, because they've learned what the public response looks like. Hikers on Cathedral Rock trails pull out their phones and record lights that vanish before they can be identified. The videos circulate briefly, get explained away, and disappear from the conversation. The pattern hasn't stopped. The official answer hasn't changed. And somewhere in the space between those two facts, in that particular persistent silence, the real investigation is probably still ongoing, in rooms we don't have access to by people who know more than they are able to say. Epilogue. Today, Sedona is a thriving tourist destination. The population has grown substantially since the first sighting reports of the 1980s, and the town now receives millions of visitors each year. They come for the landscape, for the spiritual experiences, for the pink jeep tours and the art galleries and the restaurants and the astonishing desert light that turns the red rocks 100 different shades of amber and copper and burgundy as the sun moves across the sky. They come to hike Cathedral Rock and to stand on the rim above Bell Rock and to feel, if they're open to it, whatever the vortex sites offer to those who seek them out. Photographers set up their tripods before dawn and capture images that look, when they're successful, like paintings from another world. Families walk the trails, couples watch the sunset from Airport Mesa. The red rocks glow in the evening light in colours that seem too saturated to be real, and the sky above them deepens from pale blue to indigo to the absolute star-dense black of high desert night, and it is beautiful in the way that very few places on Earth are beautiful, with the specific, overwhelming beauty of deep geological time made visible, of ancient stone shaped by forces and across timescales that dwarf anything in the human record, and occasionally someone looks up and sees something they cannot explain, a light that moves wrong, a formation that doesn't correspond to any aircraft they know, a shape that is there and then is not there, and leaves them standing on the trail with the particular mixture of wonder and unease, and almost understanding that dozens of witnesses before them, stretching back across 4 decades, have also felt in this same spot, under this same sky. They pull out their phones, they try to record it. Sometimes they do, and the recording shows something ambiguous that can be explained in multiple ways. Sometimes the object is gone before the camera is ready. Sometimes they watch it for what feels like a long time, long enough to be certain of what they're seeing, and then it accelerates upward and is gone, and the sky is empty, and the red rocks are silent, and the stars continue their ancient indifferent burning overhead. They walk back to town. They think about it for a while. Some of them tell people and some of them don't. The ones who do tell people encounter the same responses that witnesses have always encountered. Reasonable skepticism, gentle mockery, the quick recourse to standard explanation. And most of them eventually do what human beings do with experiences that don't fit the available frameworks. They set it aside, they move on, they continue their lives. But they don't forget what they saw. That's the consistent detail in the accounts. Decades later, witnesses who saw lights over Sedona in 1991 can describe what they saw with a clarity and specificity that ordinary memories don't maintain. It stayed with them in a way that unusual experiences do when they resist the explanations available to us. When the mind can't file something properly, it keeps returning to it, turning it over, looking for the angle that makes it fit. And if something has been appearing over Sedona for more than 40 years, returning to the same coordinates, following the same patterns, drawing the same silence from the same institutions, then whatever it is not waiting for us to figure it out. It is simply there, and then gone, and then there again. Patient, consistent, indifferent to our frameworks. Whatever is happening in Sedona is not random. That much at least the record makes clear, and not random means something. Not random means it has a reason. Not random means that somewhere, in some form of awareness that we may or may not be equipped to recognise, the red rock desert of northern Arizona matters. The question is why? And the silence that surrounds that question, deep, institutional, decades long, suggests that someone, somewhere, may already know.